Hello and welcome to Six Part. Today I'm gonna start a new series. What if Deku and Class 1A played the Squid Game? Part 1. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
Izuku Midoriya awoke to the sound of his alarm, yelling the well-known phrase, plus ultra. From all might. He shut it off, stretched, and gave a long, loud yawn. The time always reads 5 in the morning. He got up for his morning jog at this time every morning, and every morning was awful. He dressed slowly and went downstairs to their dorm building. Izuku noticed a well-known redhead in the main living area, doing push-ups and doing some homework. He appeared to be as anxious as he usually is in Hero Law's class. The red-headed person looked up and grinned, "Of course not. This class is killing me." Izuku simply laughed and started his morning jog, running around the school's exterior. He stretched and smiled over waves from the door, saying, "Hey Kirishima, any luck with yesterday's lesson?" He smiles as he looks up at the sky. There wasn't a cloud in sight to obscure the beauty of the sunrise, and the morning sky was stunning. Izuku started running a little faster because he knew that today would be lovely. He told himself, "Today is going to be a good day, I sense it." It would be an understatement to say that Class 1A was exited. Aizawa promised to take the class to an indoor water park in Tokyo for a whole weekend if every single student passed the major final exams for the first semester, which were just completed last week. To ensure that everyone passed, the entire class pitched in and supported one another's studies. The majority of students quickly grasped the material and realized they would pass with ease. However, Kirishima and Kaminari caused concern for everyone. While studying, both boys were essentially tearing out their hair. The entire class cheered and celebrated when the results showed that both boys had passed. By 1%, after half a year with the man, the entire class could see through his bluffs, despite Aizawa's attempts to pretend to be upset about having to take them to the water park. Despite his refusal to acknowledge it, he was extremely proud of his pupils. They all passed an exam with a passing average that was typically low. "Okay class, settle down. Here's the plan. Once we're settled on this bus, we're not stopping or getting off it until we arrive in Tokyo. If you need to go to the bathroom, I suggest doing so now," Aizawa said to the boisterous group. As they rushed onto the bus, every student cheered in response. The boys squabbling over who gets to go down the largest waterside first, while the girls congregate and share snacks. Bakugo was given the first chance after threatening to blow them all up. Sighing and massaging his temples, Aizawa sat in the front of the bus and listened to the cacophonous kids. After just 2 minutes on the bus, he was ready to get off. Given who one of the other supervisors was, he was not looking forward to the remaining 4 hours of the trip. "Present Mike," exclaims, "Yeah. Let's get this bus a-movin' and groovin'," as he boards the bus and completes packing all of the bags. They had a hotel reservation for the following evening. Present Mike sits next to Aizawa and smiles at the longtime friend, pleased by the positive applause from the other students. "Thanks for letting me come along. You here as a supervisor, not as a student who's going to be having fun," Aizawa says, staring at the noisy man whose headache has suddenly turned into a migraine. Mike begins to pout, but only for a brief moment. Then he stands up again, cheering and raising the volume of the students. As the final supervisor for the journey, Midnight climbs boards the bus. After conducting a head count, she authorizes the bus driver to take the wheel. The children quickly settle into their seats and begin chatting with their neighbors as soon as the bus moves. Knowing that he would regret not packing a full backpack for this trip, Aizawa climbed into his favorite yellow sleeping bag and started drinking from one of his juice pouches. Beside him, loud Present Mike chimed, "Ooh, can I have one, Aizawa?" As the man slowly raised his juice pouch to his lips and drank loudly, Aizawa slowly turned to face him, his face blank, maintaining eye contact at all times. Mike, who was present, crossed his arms and let out a loud groan, behaving like a toddler who had just been denied his favorite snack. That made Aizawa smile a little, and she turned back to the window to watch the buildings pass by. Just as he was about to fall asleep, he heard voices nearby. "Hey, Mr. Aizawa's asleep. Should we draw something on his face? Kaminari, do you have a death wish? Shut up, Jiro, I know you want to." Without opening his eyes, Aizawa said, "Touch me and I'll throw you out the window," because he disliked the sudden silences. He could tell he was inches from his face, prepared to draw whatever was on him, by the sound of someone taking a sharp breath. The frantic shuffles of students attempting to flee back to their seats pleased Aizawa. The bus started to calm down after the first hour, with only a few people having light conversations. While present Mike was telling everyone a story, Aizawa fell asleep. They have just 3 hours left to reach their destination. All Might was experiencing a feeling that could only be described as pure jealousy. He was desperate to join the rest of the class and his youthful successor of One for All. He has witnessed the growth of each of his students over the last 6 months. The entire class was friendly with one another, and they were all close. Even the most difficult student, young Bakugo, was friendly and protective of the other students in the class. One day at school, All Might heard a student spread the rumor that young Monoma from Class 1B was making fun of Class 1A as usual. However, he went too far this time, causing young Uraraka to cry. However, things took a turn for the worse once the explosive boys heard the rumor. Young Monoma was pinned to the ground after the blonde exploded on him, threatening to rearrange his face in a heartbeat if he ever came close to Class 1A again. The entire school was aware of the boy's seriousness. Young Bakugo has never missed an opportunity to blow things up. Young Bakugo's intense pressure on young Monoma's face made it difficult for him to nod. Never taking his eyes off the boy on the floor, he dismounted and wiped his palms on his jeans. Only when he heard the all-too-familiar voice standing in front of the onlookers behind him did he look up. "Thank you." Bakugo blushed, nodded, and slipped his hands into his pockets before leaving as if nothing had happened. Young Uraraka's eyes and nose were both red. Although All Might wished he could be with his students, he was sadly unable to assist them in the event of an emergency due to his time constraints. That class alone has seen more villains than some of the pro heroes he knows, so he prayed nothing would happen. Their high school experience didn't need to be ruined by anything else. All Might's phone buzzed while he was working on some routine teacher paperwork at his desk. He pulled it out, grinning as he looked at the screen. The screen displayed a happy young Izuku Midoriya in the front of a crowded bus with happy faces from all of the students. No matter what happened, they always seemed so happy, which was something he always loved about that class. Over the picture, the words, "Wish you were here with us. Everyone says hi," were displayed. All Might tried to return to his work after saving the picture to his phone, but he kept glancing at it. As he observed their youthful, cheerful faces, he noticed that Aizawa was sleeping peacefully next to present Mike, who was applying sticky notes to the impoverished man's face. He couldn't control the little laugh that came out of his mouth. Over his shoulder, he heard Snipe ask, "Is that from Midoriya? Your class sure is a bubbly one, isn't it, All Might?" Before long, the other employees in the teacher's lounge were observing the picture from above. It's nice to see them so lively, especially after all the villain attacks to them lately. Their only students yet are being forced to put their lives on the line daily. Blood King responds with his arms raised. My Class 1B has only come across villains when they're around your Class 1A. Some are still shooken by what happened at the camp. All Might nodded, comprehending the man's point. After encountering a villain, ordinary students would be frightened, but Class 1A is only motivated to improve and put in more effort. They really were amazing. The other teachers grabbed his phone so they could have a good look at it. Looking at the clock, All Might got up and stretched. He instructed young Midoriya to notify him when the class arrived in Tokyo, saying that 2 more hours would bring them there. The teachers gave him a long list of things they wanted, and he said, "I'll be back, going to go see what's in the cafeteria. Anyone want anything?" All Might left the room and made his way to the cafeteria after attempting to write down everything that was being said to him at once. He reached for his phone and saw the picture, realizing the others still had it. "It looks like you'll have to wait to text young Midoriya back." He placed his order with Lunch Rush inside the cafeteria and paid for everything. I believe Lunch Rush would have smirked if he had been able to. While preparing the meal and beverages he had requested, he inquired, "You got stuck with lunch duty today, All Might?" "Yep, it seems so. I'm still trying to figure out how I'm gonna carry it all back." All Might laughed and nodded. Lunch Rush said, "Don't worry, I'll stack the trays nicely in your arms for you," while laughing and turning to face All Might. Once all of the orders were finished, he began to slowly return to the staff room. Balancing a tray full of beverages on one arm while holding 2 trays full of food stacked on top of one another on the other. He had just turned a corner when Blood King almost knocked him down. All Might reprimanded, "Hey, watch it, I could have dropped all the food." But he straightened up after seeing Blood King's expression and became more vigilant. "What's wrong? I haven't seen you this worked up in a long time." Blood King, who had been gasping for air, showed All Might the picture that young Midoriya had sent him on his phone. "I've seen the picture, Blood King, that's my cell you holding," he said, looking at it bewildered, and Blood King shot his head quickly. "It's not the picture. Well, It is, but he interrupted himself to show him the picture again after frantically tapping on the screen to turn it to himself. Now, All Might could see what was causing the man's panic. The food and drink trays fell to the ground, and he grabbed his phone and stared at it in alarm and concern. A villain in all black was clinging to the side of the bus and pointing a gun at the camera behind young Uraraka's beaming face. Even though his entire face and body were covered, his bloodthirsty, flaming eyes were clearly visible. With All Might at his side, Blood King exclaimed, "We already told the principal, and everyone's jumping into cars to chase down the bus. I came to get you because I know damn well you won't want to be left behind. No one can get into contact with Aizawa, Present Might, or Midnight either. Even the bus driver won't answer." All Might immediately grabbed his phone and attempted to call young Midoriya. He responds while pleading and praying. No response. He shouted, "God damn it! Why? Why now? Why them?" and attempted to call once more. When he got to the cars, he hurried into the nearest one that had a vacancy, Blood King following closely behind. The car wasted no time in speeding off in the direction the bus had been going. "Let them arrive in time, please. Everyone say cheese," shouted Midoriya as she snapped the photo. He grinned as he returned to his seat and sent it to All Might, eager to see his response. He knew that All Might was safer away from them, and he hated to admit that the poor man wanted to come. He also knew that All Might was aware of this. Uraraka leaned over the back of his chair and stared at the screen, asking, "What do you think he's gonna do when he sees it?" "Not sure, but I'm sure right now he's sulking over not being here." Midoriya grinned and turned to face her. He laughed. But when he turned around, he didn't see her face. He was not greeted by a warm smile and a bob of brown hair, nor was he greeted by two large brown eyes and bright pink cheeks. His soul was torn apart by the intensely red eyes that greeted him. He couldn't believe what he was seeing and could only stare wide-eyed. There was a villain hanging on the bus's side, looking directly into his eyes. Before realizing that no one else had noticed their guest, what seemed like hours passed. He was about to turn to shout at their teacher, who was sleeping, when he noticed something reflecting the sun. Fear froze him in his seat as he turned to look back. Through the window, a gun was now aimed at his face. He started to shake and frantically tried to think of something to do. Uraraka looks worried and asks, "Hey Deku, you okay? You look so pale all of a sudden?" She notices that he is staring at something behind her rather than at her. She looked to see what could frighten her best friend so much, but instead she saw the villain's eyes squint as if he were grinning, and he lowered the gun slowly. She uttered softly, too scared to acknowledge her own words. Iida, who was standing next to her, looked over and said, "What did you say, Uraraka?" "Hey, what's wrong with you two? Midoriya, Uraraka." Present Mike heard it clearly over the rest of the bus's chatter, and he turned around just in time to see the villain pointing the gun at his students' faces as he was about to pull the trigger. Present Mike wasn't the only one who noticed the finger tightening around the trigger. Midoriya also saw that the gun was moved to aim at the frozen Uraraka, and he jumped over the seat on top of her without thinking, using his quirk in his legs, just as the bullet was released from the gun's barrel. The bullet went straight through the glass, shattering it, and buried itself in Midoriya's shoulder. Aizawa was not prepared when he heard the shot and saw a bloody Midoriya on top of Uraraka as a villain clung just outside their window, too close to Aizawa's students for his comfort. Before he could even take a step closer, he saw the villain lift his arm into view again, this time holding a trigger. His eyes widened as he realized what was about to happen. "Everyone get down." The bus was thrown off the highway they were on and into an open field they were driving past when he yelled, and the students screamed as they were thrown around the bus as it rolled. The villain stood on the road and watched the ball of fire stop rolling and settle into one spot, and he could see some students lying on the grass outside, clearly thrown from the bus. He was sitting in what had been a window, but now it was broken glass digging into his skin, and Bakugo's head whipped over as he heard a cough to his right. Squinting, he could barely make out the red head that was pinned under what had been a chair in the bus. Everything hurt, and when he tried to push himself from his stomach, he discovered the sharp pain of a broken bone in his left arm. Kirishima looked over and locked eyes with Bakugo, and his eyes were filled with worry. "You okay, man?" His breath caught mid-sentence as he asked, and Bakugo nodded. "Yeah, but what the fuck happened?" "All I can recall is riding the bus, hearing a gunshot, and then everything blew up. And this explosion wasn't me," he said, turning to face the red-headed man. "I don't know what happened. I saw Midoriya and Uraraka go as pale as statues, then suddenly Midoriya jumped on her and..." Kirishima looked around him for anyone else. He stopped and gasped, eyes widening. "Midoriya got shot." "God forbid." Do you believe he is dead? He could feel himself begin to panic. His breathing became shorter as he found it was hard to even breathe. Oi! Calm down. We must get off this bus before it blows up again. Kirishima nodded and attempted to get out of the chair that had pinned him, but he was unable to muster the strength to do so on his own. He saw the blonde approach and pull on the chair enough for him to slip out of its hold. He took a deep breath, but as soon as they were in fresh air, he started coughing, and as he was about to head back in, he saw a bleeding Aizawa with his scar under his eye reopening. Don't. He coughed, holding his side, don't go back in, it's not safe. He glared at the bleeding man, saying, if the bus exploding hadn't already irritated you, then this did it. Other people are still on that bus. I will not abandon them to perish by burning. The villain who did this is still around and could attack at any moment. We need to make sure he isn't already killing off students on the other side of this burning bus, Aizawa said, covering his mouth with his hand as he yelled, then dropped it from Bakugo's mouth. Bakugo looked at the burning bus and couldn't stop the word fuck from escaping his lips. Yaoyorozu was assisting in the bandaging of her injured classmates. She wasn't a doctor, but she reasoned that if it stopped the bleeding, she must be doing it correctly. Meanwhile, Todoroki was limping from student to student across the fire, reassuring them that they were at least alive. Todoroki, do you see any teachers? As he carried over an unconscious Koda, she inquired. He shook his head and turned to face the expanding flames. No, they must be on the other side of the bus, he said, hoping that no one was inside. Do you know what caused the explosion? He asked, looking over at her as she shook her head. Mister, however, Aizawa shouted as though he knew it would happen. Then there was that loud sound as well. Do you not believe it was a villain? She said, glancing up at the Todoroki, who was looking around and thinking about what had happened before. He nodded his head and sighed, saying, it had to be a villain, what else could it have been? He turned to face the road as a man completely dressed in black approached an unconscious Midnight. His heart stopped as he saw the man raise his gun, pointed at her head, and pull the trigger, killing her. Yaoyorozu gasped and covered her mouth, trembling. He killed her. She said quietly. They both realized at the same time that this man wasn't afraid to kill anyone. They were intended to perish in the bus explosion. They looked at each other and knew what the other person was thinking. If we're seen, we're dead. They both watched the villain approach the bus in silence until Todoroki spoke first, saying, Yaoyorozu, make something to drag them with and go to the other side of the bus. He wanted to face this villain by himself. Are you crazy? She said, her jaw dropping as she stared at him. You'll be damned. I can't abandon you. For a brief moment, he glanced down at her once more and said, look, you're wasting time. Move them to the opposite side and then send them back up. There must be at least one of our teachers left. She began creating something to facilitate the transportation of the others after biting her lip, saying, you better not die, do you hear me? He nodded sharply and assisted her in getting everyone onto the little cart they had constructed. Iida needed to get them both out of this bus and to safety, but every time he tried to move it, it kept collapsing more and more on top of them. He gritted his teeth, trying to think of a quick escape plan, and he closed his eyes tightly, racking his brain to figure something out quickly. He was surrounded by darkness and fire, with both Uraraka and Midoriya in his arms. He heard a gunshot a short while ago, and was concerned about who was on the receiving side. Hey! Who's in here? Kirishima's voice has never sounded so good. He could have cried if this wasn't such a serious moment. He tried to call back but could only cough, but that seemed to be enough as he heard rushed footsteps come towards them and skid to a stop in front of him. Iida. Are you all doing okay? Before he could respond, he gently removed Uraraka from his arms and turned and fled, watching as Kirishima's back disappeared into the flames, only to return shortly after, capturing Midoriya. I'm fine, but they are hurt, please assure their safety. He said. As he assisted Midoriya in reaching Kirishima, Iida managed to say, don't worry, I'll be right back for you. The flames were getting closer. He yelled and took off once again, however while he was gone a piece of the roof caved blocking the way Kirishima was using to get to Iida. When it fell it made the smoke poof to Iida's face, causing him to cough. He could hear distant yelling but everything seemed so far away. He looked up and locked eyes with Kirishima's worried eyes. Iida could see Kirishima was yelling something but all he could hear was the roof creaking, about to give and crumble onto him. Iida did what he knew his big brother would do at this moment. He sat up strong and tall and shined a smile as the roof finally gave, making Kirishima watch as fire and debris buried his class president. He kept yelling his name as he felt arms wrap around him and pull him from the bus as the rest of it collapsed. He fell back into Bakugo's arms and turned his face to look at him. Tears welled up in his eyes. Iida he. Bakugo held him tighter. I know, but we can't think about all we've lost yet. The villain is still out there and we have to find him before Iida's not the only one who isn't come home, okay? Kirishima had never heard Bakugo talk so softly. It was nearly more terrifying than their current predicament. As they stood and gazed at the blaze that had once been their bus, he could only nod. The villain approached the fire and observed its collapse. He hoped there were no students inside because he would hate for either of them to get away with it. He easily avoided the ice that was coming at him, and as he looked over, he noticed a boy with half-white, half-red hair staring at him. He smirked after giving the child a long look. If these kids don't know the quirk, don't they know not to attack? With his fingers snapping, he slowly raised his hand and pointed it at the boy. The boy stiffened, bracing himself for the possibility. The sound of the man snapping his fingers was so loud that it reverberated throughout the entire field they were in. The first person to hear it fell to the ground, unconscious. After moving around, the villain began dragging each student and dumping them all in a large pile. He counted 18 in all, and if his recollection of their faces was accurate, he assumed that the blue-haired engine kid and the small purple-headed man with the sticky balls were gone. Oh well, he called, and the students were loaded onto a truck shortly after. He saw Present Mike and Eraserhead, both unconscious from his quirk. He casually drew his gun and fired at them both, being careful not to kill them. He would need them alive to report what transpired to the police if his plan was to succeed. After loading the students, he climbed into the passenger seat of the truck and watched the fire in the side mirror go out. They had been driving for nearly an hour and a half when All Might kept attempting to call people. Fortunately, they didn't have to worry about speed limits because the police were in front. He watched the hills and trees go by while resting his head on the window. He could feel the cars slowing down to a stop, so he called young Midoriya's phone again. Confused, he looked up to see people running around and leaping out of their cars. All Might jumped out after feeling sick to his stomach. All they could see from their car were the trees, but when they got to the first car, they found themselves next to an open field that shouldn't have anything in it. This one, however, featured a smoking heap of debris that vaguely resembled a bus. There were screech marks all over the road, followed by a trail where the bus rolled. A few of the fires were still burning. The villain had already made his move, so they arrived too late. He hurried over when he heard a lot of shouting across the road. The sight of a dead Midnight lying on the road with a bullet hole visible on her forehead caught him off guard. After one of the police officers yelled, everyone search the area. I want these students found now. Everyone started frantically looking for the Class 1A students who had gone missing. However, there were no indications. Near the bus, Present Mike and Aizawa were discovered by someone, both shot but barely alive. Both of them were hurried off to the closest hospital. They discovered young Iida and young Minetta's remains while searching the bus. Both lives were taken far too quickly. From the size of the tire tracks in the grass leading back to the road, All Might could tell that they belonged to a fairly large truck. The police all understood what it meant after he showed them. Officially, villains have abducted Class 1A. Since the start of the school year, Class 1A has gained a lot of popularity among people worldwide as well as in Japan. Initially making headlines due to the USJ attack. However, nobody alive after the sports festival didn't recognize the faces of the Class 1A pupils. They were frequently featured in the media, either as interview subjects or as part of yet another villainous assault. Following Bakugo's abduction, the nation appeared more interested in Class 1A and their advancements in hero training than in real heroes. The media immediately swarmed the school campus in an attempt to gather any information they could after learning that something had happened to their beloved young heroes. Fans nationwide were glued to their screens, hoping to see the principal reassure them that nothing had happened and smile at the cameras. They became more concerned, though, when the media reported on the families of the Class 1A students being escorted by the police into the main building. The entire campus was encircled by police, who were on high alert. In order to accommodate the flow of police cars and anxious parents picking up their kids, they made an effort to keep the media to the side of the main entrance. Every student was being sent home for the remainder of the week as the entire school was evacuated. Teachers could only assure anxious parents and students that they would be notified when classes resumed on time. However, this didn't ease the anxiety that was rising inside of them. The students couldn't help but notice the police swarming and searching the Class 1A dorm house as the dorms were evacuated. Some students left campus to go home with their families, while others remained to look for answers like everyone else. The principal gazed out the main building's window as the media questioned anyone who happened to pass by. When he witnessed his students shaking their heads, he told the media that even they were unaware of the situation. He could hear the parents' anxious questions and voices, and he was dreading the meeting he was about to have. Although the families of Minoru Mineta and Tenya Iida were not present in the classroom, he was able to confirm at the morgue that the burned bodies removed from the bus's remains were, in fact, their sons, which made his heart ache. Additionally, Midnight's family was notified of her passing. They dutifully bestowed upon the principal the honor of alerting the world to the passing of the well-known R-rated hero. They would know right away that something had happened to the class if they told the media about her passing, and they wouldn't be able to keep them off school property. Police found the dispersed remains of the bus driver while they were still searching the explosion site. He appeared to have been right next to one of the explosions that sent the bus rolling. As a hand landed gently on his shoulder, the principal almost jumped out of his rage, lost in thought of the poor 4 who had died and wondering how the other 18 missing students and the 2 injured teachers were doing. As he told him it was time, he glanced up at Officer Kenji Suragame, the half-dog man who appeared rather dejected. After giving a slow nod, the principal entered the 1A classroom, which was filled with the parents of the students who had previously occupied the desks there. The parents were bewildered, anxious, and rather noisy. A tall man in a fancy suit said, "Would someone tell us what the hell is going on? Our children went on a field trip and none of us can contact any of them." The principal identified the man as Momo Yaoyorozu's father during the parent-teacher conference at the start of the school year. Among the few who were admitted on recommendation was his daughter. He was about to start yelling again when he saw Principal Nezu enter, but a woman who looked like a frog forced him to sit down. She uses the same monotone as her daughter Suyu Asui when she says, "We are all worried for our children, but yelling won't help them, sir." Endeavor, the number 2 hero, was standing with his arms folded and leaning against the rear wall. As her son does every class, he yelled, "You all are too noisy. Did you forget the pro heroes Midnight, Present Mike, and Eraserhead were with our children? You don't give us heroes enough credit." She stood up and slammed her fist into her son's desk. She screamed, "Oi! How about you shut your mouth before I make you?" as her husband frantically tried to make her sit down. Mrs. Inko Midoriya got up and turned to face her old friend, sensing a fight was about to break out. Like her son, she fidgeted with her hands and said, "Please, Mitsuki, we're all worried, but fighting each other won't help us find out about our children." Mitsuki Bakugo sat down next to her husband and apologized to Inko after witnessing her old friend's distress. With a tiny remote in hand, Principal Nezu stepped onto his tiny ladder so that everyone in the room could see him. He turned to face the large screen behind him and pressed a button on the remote control, which displayed the image of the bus's smiling students, the exact image that Midoriya had sent All Might before they all vanished. The parents' classroom gaped at the picture, perplexed. Why all this commotion over a picture? Before he spoke, Nezu turned to face the parents and inhaled deeply. Not sure how to inform them of the news. Izuku Midoriya sent this picture to All Might at 2 p.m. today. It may look like a happy picture, but once we saw this, he interrupted himself and turned to face the image, zooming in on the villain's icy face while gripping the side of the bus gun pointed at the camera. The lens was pierced by red eyes. Panic and sharp gasps filled the entire classroom. Nezu went on before the parents could start shouting again. He trailed off, watching as the faces staring at him grew paler by the moment, their eyes wide with fear. Once we discovered this uninvited man in the photograph, we tried to make contact with the bus. No one was able to contact anyone from the bus, and no one has heard from anyone after this photo was taken. We found the bus, completely blown to bits in a field on the side of the road. Police found both pro heroes Present Mike and Eraserhead shot and bleeding out, but alive. They are both inside the ICU on life support fighting to live as we speak, he forced himself to say, but before he could finish, a man with a bird's head stood up and claimed to be the voice. Was there not 3 heroes along with the students for this trip? And the bus driver as well as all our children, he said, his voice becoming louder as he spoke. Nezu is forced to sit down by a woman he thinks is his wife, who shakes her head at him and threatens to cry, silently telling him enough. Pro hero Midnight was found on the road, shot. Unlike the other 2 pro heroes, she didn't make it. Principal Nezu gazed at them, his eyes filled with pain, and he tried to speak as quietly as possible. The bus driver's remains were also found on the road. Police believe an explosion went off right beside him. Police also found the remains of young Tenya Iida and Minoru Mineta inside the bus. The room fell silent for the first time since the start of the meeting. Nobody was even breathing, allowing the new information to sink in. 2 supervisors, including a pro hero, and 2 students were killed. After a few minutes of waiting, Nezu said, "The safety of our students has always been a top priority. The 4 individuals I just mentioned were the only ones found. As of right now, all your children are captured by the red-eyed villain. We are doing everything in our power to find our children, and we will not stop till we do." He bowed as far down as he could to the parents. "We are truly sorry for this happening," said the staff and police in the room, bowing as low as the mouse man. Nobody anticipated that the first voice to break the silence would be that of Lil Inko Midoriya. She stood and turned to face the men and women who were bowing in front of them. She turned to the floor and watched her tears fall to the ground, saying, "We as a parent of a child who is dedicated to becoming a hero, I knew my son's life was going to be put in danger. I just didn't think I would lose him so soon." She was unable to contain her tears and sobbed into her hands. As the short woman sobbed, Mitsuki Bakugo stood up, gathered her friend into her arms, and held her. It appeared that every parent was about to cry or hit something. A few parents gazed blankly, seemingly unable to accept that any of this was real. No one moved in the classroom until Mr. Uraraka slowly stood up, wrapped his arms around his sobbing wife, and said, "If it helps find our children, then I think I speak for everyone here on saying do what you need to." The police noticed the parents, who were understandably upset, and looked at them. "The sooner we tell the media, the sooner more eyes are looking for your children, but we need all of your permission to say anything. If any of you wish for us not to say anything to the media, please say so now." With a nod, the officer escorted the diminutive principal out of the room. Nezu paused and glanced back at the bus's photo of the happy kids. He saw Tenya Iida grinning while being held by a laughing Ochako Uraraka, who made a peace sign with her outstretched hand. Sitting on the lap of a bright-eyed but slightly irritated-looking Yayorozu, Minoru Mineta was giving the thumbs up. Up front, Midnight gave the bus driver bunny ears as he leaned into the camera's field of view, but he smiled and kept his eyes on the road. Who knows if the 18 students who are currently missing will ever be seen or heard from again, and neither of those faces would ever smile again. The media started shouting 1,000 questions at once as soon as the principal left the main building. He heard a lot of people asking why Shoto Aizawa and Present Mike were not among the group of teachers they saw with the police, or why no students from Class 1A were observed leaving the building. Nezu headed to the clearing the police had prepared for him so he could tell the world that the bad guys had attacked his school and its students once more. As you all may already know, I am Principal Nezu of UA. Today at 12 p.m. Hero Course Class 1A left our facility on their way to Tokyo for a field trip. With them were 3 pro heroes, Present Mike, Midnight, and the class's homeroom teacher Eraserhead. At 2 p.m. it is believed the bus was attacked by a single villain. At this time the motives are unknown, and all we know of is one villain dressed in black, with all but his red eyes visible. Police discovered the bus had been blown off the side of the road, where they found it still on fire. The deceased bodies of pro hero Midnight, the bus driver, and students Tenya Iida and Minoru Mineta. Following the deaths of the 4, the news spread. What about the other students? What happened to the other 2 pro heroes, Present Mike and Eraserhead? Do you know if anyone else was killed? How can you declare your school is safe, yet students and teachers are dying? Nezu kept talking after the yelling subsided a bit despite the police's efforts to quiet the crowd. Please, I understand your concerns at the moment. The school is working closely with the police to find the missing students. Shoto Aizawa and Present Mike were found unconscious at the scene, both in critical conditions. As we speak, both pro heroes are fighting to live inside a secured hospital. Whether the villain intended for them both to live or not is still unknown. We will keep the media updated as the investigation continues. Until this is solved and we know the students of our school is safe, all classes have been postponed till further notice. We thank you for your cooperation. After that he left and returned to the building, disregarding the calls from behind at him. All he could hope for was the survival of his students. Izuku Midoriya hissed at the pain in his neck from sleeping in such an odd position as he slowly opened his heavy eyes. When he attempted to raise his arms to sit up, he was immediately reminded of the deep wound caused by the bullet in his shoulder. After grabbing it, he slowly sat up and tried to focus his gaze on his surroundings. He first became aware that he was in the rear of a moving truck that was moving based on his senses. Second, he saw that everyone else in his class was unconscious and moving slowly in time with the moving truck's tremors. They bumped into something, and a flash of light blinded Midoriya. As he turned to face the source, he saw that his friends and his own bodies had leapt along with the backsliding door. He turned quickly to the nearest person and shook them while yelling, "Kachin! Wake up!" He attempted to shake the other people in the truck, stepping on Hagaker's arm by mistake, but he soon realized they wouldn't be waking up anytime soon. He struggled to stay upright as he stood up and looked around the back of the truck. He hoped they were still alive because there were no teachers present. He heard Mr. Aizawa scream to get down as everything turned black because the explosion happened so fast. He recalled being drugged away as Iida grinned at him after he woke up in someone's arms. He couldn't tell whether or not that was a dream because everything around them was so dark. In addition, he noticed that Iida and Mineta were not among the group of students who were lying on the truck's floor due to sleep deprivation. He kept frantically trying to wake people up in the hopes that someone would wake up like he did, but that hope was fading quickly. Although it was difficult to see in the darkness, he could see that everyone was just as hurt as he was. They all had burns and cuts, and Kachan's arm appeared to be bent strangely. Some of Tokiyami's feathers were gone, leaving his head with bald, burned spots, and one of Ishido's horns was missing from the pink fluff she called her hair. Both Kaminaras's arm and Kirishima's back were severely burned. It appeared that the rest of his friends were doing fairly well. Since Uraraka was one of his closest friends and he would be sad to lose her, he took care to check her thoroughly. Midoriya moved to the back of the truck and, using his only strong arm, slowly raised the sliding door after another large bump and flash of light. He was shocked and suspicious to find that the door was unlocked, and he had no trouble opening it. He closed his eyes, blinded by the sudden light, and almost fell out of the back. He slowly opened his eyes and saw the shapes of buildings in the distance. As they drove down what seemed to be a highway, he gripped his bleeding gun wound tightly and looked around the town. He turned to face the car that was pursuing them and saw a woman in the front seat filming him with her phone while the driver was on the phone. When other people on the street saw the battered and bloody boy in the back of the truck, they also took out their phones, pointed at him, and fled for assistance. The truck abruptly applied the brakes, throwing Midoriya onto his back and back into the vehicle. He gasped suddenly as pain shot through his body, striking his head with a jarring force. He made himself sit up in an attempt to focus his now hazy eyes. He found it difficult to even think as his mind started to feel cloudy. Gazing back, he witnessed the driver of the vehicle now parked behind the stationary truck exit his vehicle and sprint towards the truck's opening while remaining glued to his phone. Some of what he was saying Midoriya could make out faintly. He heard him exclaim in utter horror, "His head and shoulder are bleeding bad. Oh my god, the whole back of the truck is full of children." Izuku recognized All Might as the man when he saw his blonde hair. He saw All Might's hand extend toward him, pleading with him to take it. When Izuku saw the all-too-familiar gun turn the corner and shoot the man in the head, he was about to grab the hand and slowly raised his arm while muttering All Might's name. Along with everyone else in the vicinity, he could hear the woman he had seen earlier in the car scream. He began to sway and his eyes grew heavy because it sounded so far away. He saw the same blazing red eyes that he had seen outside the bus window when he looked up. The last sound he heard before fainting was the sound of fingers snapping as he watched the man raise his free hand. Unconscious, he collapsed onto his side. After hurriedly closing the truck door and locking it, the villain made sure the door had truly closed. He turned to see that everyone within earshot of him had also been rendered unconscious by the shock. When he noticed a street camera aimed directly at them, giving him a front row seat to everything that had just transpired, his eyes widened. He quickly got back into his truck and drove off, disregarding all traffic laws. He had to get a new car quickly or this whole thing would be in vain. Forced to take a break from the investigations supervisor, All Might sat down next to his longtime friend Tsukachi in his police cruiser. They were collaborating with the group tasked with following the path they thought the tire tracks were taking. When a coffee was handed to him, he accepted it with pleasure and took sips. "Thank you," he said softly, and Tsukachi nodded. As they sat there in silence, they both considered how few leads they had so far. They had no idea what kind of car they were searching for. All they could hope was that they would know once they saw it. Tsukachi sipped his coffee and asked, "Do you think it has to do with All for One?" Since they were the only two in the car, it was safe to discuss the topic. "I'm not sure. To attack an entire class for just one student seems too risky. I have a bad feeling this is going to be something big," All Might said, shaking his head. He then glanced at his friend after he nodded. "You need to stop blaming yourself. Everyone can tell you are. If you were on that bus we could have had more than 4 bodies. Or there could have been no bodies," All Might thought aloud as he gazed down at his steaming coffee. When his cell phone rang, Tsukachi was about to argue. He looked at the name and said, "Weird, I haven't talked to my brother in years." Tsukachi nodded and picked up his phone, putting down his coffee as All Might glanced over at his friend. "Perhaps he saw you were involved on such a big case and wants to check to make sure you're okay." All Might heard the voice on the other end of the phone shouting something quickly, and he saw his friend's face drop before starting his car. "Where are you? Do not lose that truck, you hear me?" He yelled out the window, claiming to have a lead on a moving truck that was leaving a town about an hour away from their location. His brother swore he saw bodies inside the truck when the rear door opened. They all drove quickly to the town where the truck was spotted after the supervisor instructed them to hurry on the lead. He was driving as fast as he could, following the other police cars that were racing towards the town. "Bro, is your wife with you? Get her to take pictures of the truck." "Maybe a video would be better," he said. They could only hope it was worth it because it was their first and only lead. The knot in All Might's stomach grew stronger as he prayed that this would be them and that they would be able to save the young students before it was too late. To allow All Might to hear the conversation, Tsukachi places his cell phone on the dash and turns it to speaker. After watching his friend push a number of buttons, he switches on his radio so the other members of the squad hurrying to the town can hear the call. He told everyone about the truck and the potential bodies inside, as well as what he currently knew. They all hoped the bodies were still breathing, but nobody said it. "Oh my god. There's a boy in the truck. He's hurt bad and seems dazed, almost like he's drugged," was the panicked voice that suddenly rang from the cell phone. All Might could hear a woman speaking in the background, but nobody could understand what she was saying. "Just calm down, okay? We're on our way, don't let the driver know you're onto him. Can you describe the boy for me as detailed as you can?" was the tactic Tsukachi used to stay composed during his years on the force. They could tell he was nodding because he started talking about the boy. "He's standing against the truck's wall, looking like he's having trouble standing and focusing on anything. He's wearing what I believe was once a white long-sleeve shirt and simple jeans, but both are stained bright red and dark brown with blood. His hair looks green, sticking all over the place. Some strands are clinging to the blood on his freckles. He looks really bad, Tsukachi. If All Might hadn't already suffered a heart attack, that was undoubtedly the cause. He has freckles on his face and green hair that sticks out everywhere." He remembered the simple white shirt from the picture he got from the bus. In that truck was Izuku Midoriya. They located him. Tsukachi bit his lip in an attempt to remain composed. "Do not get out of the car. Stay where you are and act like nothing's happened." Was that a car door? "I said stay in the car, damn it," he yelled to the phone as they heard the truck screech to a stop, followed by the brother's voice saying, "The truck just suddenly stepped on the brakes. That boy got thrown onto his back and he's not moving." All Might clutched his seat, feeling more worthless than ever, as they heard his labored breathing followed by a gasp. "He's still conscious. He's sitting up. Something's seriously wrong though, his eyes are so foggy." Injured and bleeding out, young Midoriya had no help from his idol. The brother exclaimed in horror, "Oh my god, the entire back of the truck is packed with kids. His head and shoulder are bleeding bad." The man was instructed by the chief in command over the radio to remove the boy from the truck and attempt to save as many of the kids as he could. As he reached inside the truck, they heard the brother grunt. Izuku Midoriya's strained, pained voice called out for All Might, and everyone's hearts stopped, especially All Might's. After that, everything happened so quickly. A gunshot rang out very near the phone, followed by a woman screaming in the distance and numerous more screams, the sound of fingers snapping and a body slamming into metal. The sound of the moving truck's door being slammed shut and locked, the sound of tires speeding away and footsteps running, and finally, total silence. There was no sound on the other end of the phone when Tsukachi called out for his brother. He was lost. They reached the town where everything happened 15 minutes after the call ended. They discovered everyone in the town lying around, completely unconscious. It was All Might who saw Tsukachi's brother lying in the middle of the road, his head blown open by a gun bullet. The truck was gone from the spot in front of him. Despite being so close, they allowed another death to occur. While the rest of the squad broke into cameras located throughout the town, the chief dispatched All Might and Tsukachi to attempt to locate the truck's trail. All Might climbed into the vehicle and watched as Tsukachi snatched something from his brother's vehicle, ran over to him, jumped in, and drove off. "She was recording it. See what the truck looks like," he said as he handed All Might his sister-in-law's cell phone. All Might nodded and plugged it in. After locating the most recent video, he clicked to watch it. He described the truck and gave Tsukachi the license plate number. It's a large city-moving truck, white, with a bear on the back door stacking boxes. He saw Midoriya, who was seriously hurt, as the door abruptly slid upward. He was unable to take his eyes off the blood on his successor's face and body. Tsukachi pulled over and pointed, "There, that's the truck, right?" He didn't need to hear All Might's response because he knew the truck parked in a ditch that connected to a very busy highway was, in fact, the truck. Hoping the students were still inside, they both hurried out of the car and ran to it. They stepped back, covering their noses from the blood odor, and gasped as they opened the unlocked back door quickly. The bodies of Rikido Sato and Honta Siro hung from the truck's rear wall. Both boys were so badly chopped up that they were nearly unrecognizable. A sword stabbed both boys in the throat, holding them against the wall. "More blood will be shed tomorrow," was written in the boys' blood on the interior walls, staring both men in the face. 16 students remained unaccounted for, and 2 more had died. And there would be more deaths. When Tsukachi called the chief, he instructed them to avoid touching anything, in order to prevent passers-by from seeing the message or the poor boys' bloodied bodies hanging. They closed the door. Sitting quietly, both of them lost in their own worlds as they gazed at the truck. He couldn't shake the image of the wounded Midoriya. He kept imagining the young prodigy he had grown to see as a son hanging inside, with blood accumulating beneath his drooping feet. Tsukachi kept thinking about how he would inform the boys' families. Instead of bringing back dead bodies, he was supposed to bring back living ones. He remembered his dead older brother, who was currently lying on a road in a nearby town. He was unsure of how to explain to his parents that he heard his brother being shot and killed in an attempt to save a child he was looking for. The driver of a large yellow school bus waved as he approached his boss, who was waiting, as the bus entered an underground bunker. His supervisor appeared enraged with him. Knowing what was going to happen, the villain bit his lip and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but I brought you 16, before being killed slowly and painfully by lightning that suddenly struck out of nowhere. "Why the hell am I seeing that 2 students were found dead in the bus? I told you I wanted all 20 students." Someone hurried over and drugged him off as he fell to the ground, barely alive. The supervisor approached the bus and got inside while glaring at all of the unaware pupils. He couldn't resist giving the heroes in training a sly smile. Yes, they were going to be a really fun bunch to break. Aizawa had first realized that the pain was much worse than anything he had ever experienced. Birds were picking at the insides of his head, which felt like it had exploded. The pain made him squeeze his eyes. The second thing he realized was that something felt like a stick getting into his mouth and stabbing him in the throat. No matter how hard he tried, his body refused to comply with his commands to move. What on earth became of him? It was so difficult for him to think, move, or do anything that he couldn't recall what he had done most recently. He allowed the darkness to engulf him again slowly. The pain in Aizawa's head persisted when he woke up the next morning. Although it wasn't as shocking this time, he appeared to be growing accustomed to the pain. It sucked that the rod was still in his throat. He felt his fingers moving slowly, and he reasoned that if his fingers could move, then maybe his eyes could, too. He forced his dry eyes open with what little strength he had left. He was the brightest thing ever, holy fuck. As his eyes gradually acclimatized, he became aware that he was in a hospital. A medical facility? Did the bullet train strike him? It certainly felt that way to him. When he tested his range of motion, he discovered that only his fingers and head had moved thus far. Everyone must begin somewhere, he surmised. He noticed that he wasn't alone in his hospital room when he turned his head as far to the left as he could. Another man was lying in a bed just like his. From where he lay, Aizawa was unable to see the man's face. Huge tubes protruded from the other man's mouth, and additional IVs and other medical devices were thrown out of his body in different locations. Aizawa pondered whether that was how he appeared and whether the rod down his throat could be explained by the same enormous tubes coming from his mouth. Aizawa looked at the man and saw that he was covered in bandages. He had no shirt on, but his entire body was wrapped in bandages. He looked in the mirror, catching a glimpse of his own body and chest. A thin hospital blanket covered him from hip to hip, but beneath the thin sheet, Aizawa could still see lumps where a cast had been applied to his right knee. He had a mummy-like amount of bandaging on his chest and torso, just like the man next to him. There were indications of blood leaking through some areas. Those must be the more severe ones. One arm received blood, and the other arm received the more than welcome painkillers as more IVs ran from both arms. Aizawa could only speculate as to how his face and head appeared. Based on the pain, he would assume that his head was more splattered than a watermelon that had been dropped. Time seemed to slow down as he sat in theirs, he should sigh and pondered for a long time, not forgetting the enigmatic man at his side. He was at his desk reviewing the permission slips for the weekend trip when he last remembered it. Which day was it? Was the trip missed by him? He sincerely hoped not, as that would undoubtedly disappoint his pupils. He detested seeing them unhappy or in any other state than joy. Although he would never acknowledge it, he developed a particular affection for his class. He had never encountered a group of students with such a strong will. In terms of character and heroism, each of his 20 pupils was exceptional. They have repeatedly put everything on the line to save lives, large or small. The memory of his class catching school mice and releasing them in a field to avoid their death made him smile feebly. Or the morning when his entire class skipped class to help each student prepare for the impending tests in Class 1B homeroom. Why in the world couldn't he recall what had happened to him if he could recall those days? His senses grew more alert the longer he remained awake. His hearing gradually improved, and he could now make out a TV to his right. He turned to face the sound and noticed that the evening news was being broadcast on an old TV that was positioned in the upper corner. The weather report was about to be finished. It's unusually positive news from the news that there will be clear skies for the rest of the week. Usually it was gloomy. A woman's arms were folded neatly in front of her as she sat behind her news desk on the screen. She grinned, but there was sadness in her eyes. Well, this is the gloomy part that Aizawa is all too familiar with. Thank you, Stacy, for the weather report. Now for the UA update. Aizawa would have been very happy to sit up if he could have. Any news on UA? Was there an attack on the school? He was filled with worry, but he did his best to push it away. He must have given his life in order to keep the students safe if he was this hurt. He observed the newswoman rearranging her papers before turning back to face the camera when a picture appeared next to her head. His heart leapt up his throat and exploded at the sight of that one image. They were his pupils. Everywhere he looked, he saw happy, laughing faces, bright eyes, and unadulterated happiness. Present Mike was giving him fake eyebrows, a mustache, and fangs, and he could see him applying sticky notes to his face. He must remember to reimburse him for it. Following his discovery of the reason his pupils were featured on the news. It was been 8 days since Class 1A left that fateful morning, heading for a weekend of earned fun at the Tokyo Indoor Water World. Halfway to their destination, however, this villain captured in this very photo. The image zoomed in to show the individual outside the bus. By Izuku Midoriya, one of Class 1's top students, as he was sending the photo to his mother and number 1 pro hero All Might. Shortly after this photo was taken and sent, however, the world lost contact with all inside. Police discovered the remains of the bus, after being blown up from detonation bombs set by the villain seen in the photo. The man who took the picture surely. The bus blew up as they were traveling to the trip his students were talking about non-stop. That might account for the severity of his head pain, but the one question he sorely needed an answer to kept coming to mind. His students, so where the devil are they? Arriving on the scene, police made the gruesome discovery that Pro Hero Midnight, retired hero speedster who was driving the bus, and students Tenya Iida and Minoru Mineta had all lost their lives in the villain attack. Aiza's world fell apart around him, and his gaze was fixed on the pictures of the 4 people who had died. His pupils, a fellow educator and a longtime friend. Dead? How? How in the world could one villain defeat them all in this manner? They were pupils, for heaven's sake, just kids. They're only 15 years old and are just beginning their lives. He was shocked to learn that the other 18 students had gone unmentioned. He was drawn out of his reverie when the woman on the screen started talking again. Both pro heroes Eraserhead and Present Mike, who were supervisors on the trip, were found in critical condition. As we speak, they are both on life support fighting to live. He turned his head to the man to his left. Is Mike here? The more he stared, the more he believed it, even though he didn't look like himself. He didn't want to think about his appearance. Aiza's head snapped back to the screen. As for the rest of the class, all 18 students were missing. Not a trace was left for the police to go by. One man took them all and kidnapped them. This is no longer possible. Aizawa's head hurt much more than it had before, and he was clearly shaking. Police were left with little to no leads or evidence to help them find the missing students, or to assure them were still alive. While his students were going through whatever it was, he was lying here. As the truck appeared on the screen, Aizawa felt hope rise in his chest. Later, the very same day the attack happened, a civilian spotted this moving truck carrying what he described as the missing students in a nearby town. Police released this photo of the moving truck. Were his pupils located? A new image that showed a student bleeding violently while leaning against the moving truck's inner wall and the back door open appeared shortly after the first one. The green mat that Izuku Midoriya claimed to be his hair was immediately recognizable to Aizawa. The image changed to the UA campus grounds as she was speaking. The student seen has been confirmed as one of the missing Class 1A students. The civilian who suspected the moving truck tried to rescue the students while on the phone with the authorities, but sadly lost his life. Once the police arrived on the scene, they found the moving truck by a busy highway with the remains of both 1A students Honta Ciro and Rikido Sato. Both of the boys' bright smiling faces were brought to the screen, followed by the 4 deceased who had previously mentioned. A candle light service is being held tonight outside the dorm house of Class 1A, in honor of the lives lost that dark day. The candle ceremony is also to Simple Hope, to show the remaining 16 students yet to be found that our hope for their safe return will never go out, much like the candles. Candle-wielding crowds of hundreds poured out into the surrounding streets from the grounds. Aizawa noticed pictures of the dead on one side of the entrance to the dorm where his students were supposed to be staying. Additionally, pictures of the 16 students who have not yet been located were displayed on the opposite side of the entrance. The words, "We will not give up on you," were displayed on the entranceway in large letters fashioned from pictures that Aizawa assumed the families had donated. All of the people in the front of the crowd were identified by Aizawa as his students' families. Their tearful, broken faces were captured on camera. His heart ached, but he assured those parents that he would keep his students safe. Now, 16 students had simply vanished, and 4 had died. With candles in their hands, the crowd fell silent. The lights from the small flames illuminated the entire campus from above. Candles, flowers, teddies, and other gifts from concerned citizens covered the building's steps, leaving not a single inch unoccupied. Never in his life did Aizawa yearn to be somewhere. He wanted to fight to save his students and get out of this bed. Every second counted if it was true, and 8 days had gone by. His students were running out of time, and so were they. As the little woman sobbed in All Might's arms, he stood next to Inko Midoriya. He had taken her candle and was holding both in one hand while the other held the sobbing woman close as they stood in front of UA's Class 1A dorm house. He glanced at the family members' pictures hanging on the walls, hoping that one of them would be enough for someone to identify their children. Now that the police had concealed the unsettling message written in the boy's blood inside the moving truck, all anyone could do was hope. As of right now, they were unsure if any of the students were still alive. They have reached a dead end, which was painful to not know. They were left with nothing. They could only help the families for the time being and hope that something would happen. All Might initially intended to ignore the buzzing sound coming from his phone in his pocket. Then, behind him, he heard a cell and then another. Before long, cell phones started ringing everywhere. Inko Midoriya got up and turned to face the group of people who had all started removing their cells. Her worried gaze was reflected in All Might's as she looked up at him. One of the other family members who was standing close to them asked, "What's going on?" All Might turned to face the frightened families who were all asking the same question when he heard a scream from the crowd, followed by more screams, and realized something was wrong. Was the child discovered dead? The families were soon escorted inside their children's home by the police, who instructed them to cover their ears. In order to keep the families from hearing the screams and panic, the police locked and closed the doors leading them to the sitting area once they were inside. He horribly took out his phone to check on things after All Might had Mrs. Midoriya seated herself in a chair beside her friend, Mrs. Bakugo. All Might felt sick as a single link burned into his eyes. The police in the room interrupted him just as he was ready to click, bringing him back to the present. As he observed others setting up the large screen, All Might surmised that they would display the link he had been sent. He pointed to the screen at the link and clicked on it, bringing up a page with a video. It's a link leading to a live feed. "Everything you are about to see is live and happening at this very second," he said, explaining that the red-eyed villain had gotten in touch with the media and sent them the link. The whole room tensed. Was this villain's plan to force them to witness the murder of their children? Even for a villain, this is too disgusting. When the live feed eventually loaded, a big wooden table was visible. But the thing that stung the room with horror was all around the table. Chained to metal chairs at their chests are all 16 of the missing students. They were shocked to find all of their arms free and resting on the table in front of them. Every child appeared to be sleeping with their heads dangling loosely. Every parent gulped when they saw their child. Aside from Midoriya, no one had been spotted since that photo was taken. The blood that was visible all over Midoriya's skin had disappeared, and they all looked remarkably good. Apart from the wounds that appeared to reopen, all of their clothing was still smeared with blood, most of it old. Each student reported cuts, scrapes, and burns, but given how long they had been absent, things could have been much worse. It made All Might uncomfortable. What was the villain's plan if they didn't take them and murder a lot of people to avoid hurting them? Unable to take her eyes off the mess of the white and red-headed boy chained to one of the chairs, a white-haired woman stood by herself with a hand over her mouth, staring at the live feed. "My son," she whispered. Concerned that she might break at any moment, a tall man standing next to her cautiously put his arm around the fragile woman. "Hey, you see that little girl with the same ears as my wife beside him? That's my little girl. She won't let anything happen to your little boy, okay? She's a fighter and judging from the sports festival, so is your son," he replied. Mrs. Jiro, his wife, gently shifted her into the seat, covered her with a blanket, and massaged her back in circular motions. With her face buried in her husband's chest, Mitsuki Bakugo was sobbing uncontrollably. She was typically among the strongest women and never frowned, but she broke when she saw her only child, her son, chained up, with one arm bent wildly in front of him and his head dangling on his chest. All Might glanced at his phone when it rang. When he saw the hospital calling, his eyes widened. He left the room and went into the kitchen to answer the phone. He said, "Hello?" after he was certain he was free of the earshot. He most definitely wasn't expecting his voice to come through the phone. "Have you seen the live feed?" Aizawa's pain-laced voice asked. All Might was so shocked that he lost the ability to speak. For heaven's sake, the man was shot in the head, and Aizawa was supposed to be in a coma. "What, you there? I woke up earlier and saw the news about the candlelight ceremony. Then they got the live feed sent to them and all hell has broken loose. I can't remember what happened, All Might. When my students need me most I am completely useless." Never before had All Might heard his friend's voice so disoriented. "That's understandable considering you were shot in the head, Aizawa." The wounded man fell silent for a moment before continuing in a barely audible whisper, "Shot in the head? How the hell am I alive?" All Might attempted to recall everything the doctor had said to him, including, "They say the bullet went through, missing your brain entirely. Even they don't understand it. Present Mike was also shot in the head, but unlike you, his bullet did hit his brain. It's very likely the man will never wake up. If he will never be the same." Aizawa turned to face his friend, who was breathing on his own now that the tube in his throat had been removed. After he managed to sit up, he discovered his phone close by. The doctors arrived and were astounded by how well he was doing. Even though he was not visible, All Might nodded when he heard the man sigh over the phone. "I know 6 people are dead, and 4 of which being my students." His voice was quieter than he had intended. Do you know yet?" he asked. He became silent and then went on, "Siro and Sato. Me and my old friend found them. Completely chopped and sliced by the swords stabbed through them, holding them in the air against the back wall." After 8 endless days of searching, he let Aizawa process the news, which was made more painful by his use of the term, young. Both Iida and Mineta had died on the bus by the fire, both appeared to have been pinned and unable to escape. Aizawa, who was already skilled at reading people, said, "You're hiding something." All Might gasped. The villain left the message. "More blood will be shed tomorrow, in the boy's blood." Once more, the call was silent until All Might heard nurses behind Aizawa in the background. "Perhaps I should let you go. Heal up fast and get some rest. Perhaps you'll remember something that could help us find them," Aizawa said with a sigh. After saying their farewells, they both hung up the phone. All Might heard an odd scratching sound coming from the kitchen pantry just as he was ready to leave. The fluffiest cat jumped into his arms and cuddled to the man's chest as soon as he opened it. Stunned, he gazed around the tiny room while holding the cat. The poor cat was imprisoned here for a week because no new Class 1A was concealing a pet cat. The parents had all calmed down since the initial shock, so he took the cat to them. He placed the cat carefully on Mrs. Midoriya's lap after noticing that she was by herself. The parents gaped at the cat as it purred on Inko's lap before gradually bursting into a little giggle. "I think I found the kid's secret pet stowed away in his room." An invisible woman said, "That sounds like our children, they're the heroes to all after all." All Might assumed that she was wiping away her tears because the sleeve of her shirt moved close to what he thought was her head. When Inko saw the green collar around the cat's neck and looked up the name, she burst out laughing. "Our kids would think of the name, Princess Donut Sprinkle Bomb." All parents were smiling now. Mitsuki Bakugo couldn't help but laugh at the bomb part. She knew her son was the cause of that part. A little frog-like girl went up and gently pet the kitty, smiling up at Inko. Now they have to come home. A hairy infant is waiting for them. In a way that only a mother can provide, Inko nodded and smiled at her while stroking the young girl's cheek and saying, They have an even bigger reason to come back to us, sweetie. The young girl then appeared perplexed. Really? What's larger than a feline? Inko grinned. Their love for their families. Uraraka was the first to awaken, pulling her head up from her shoulder, looking at what was so tight around her chest, under her arms, and on her legs, finding her head heavier than she had anticipated and almost smashing her face on the chain, looking bewildered, then forcing her head up to see where she was, and then gasping, suddenly wide awake, sitting up as much as she could. Gee guys. Are you all doing okay? Wake up, please. Her voice was scratchy from not using it for so long. She looked beside her and sees Izuku sleeping with his head hanging on his chest, also chained to a metal chair. He looked awful, his shoulder that took the bullet for her was facing right at her, making her guilt worse. He got hurt because she froze up, she should have been killed but selfless Deku saved her life once again. She carefully leaned over, arm reaching towards him. Deku. She heard a small click behind her head and froze. Slowly she sat back up straight in her seat, completely tense. She carefully reached her arms up to touch what was behind her head. She couldn't stop the loud sharp gasp that left her mouth as she felt a barrel of a shotgun aiming straight to her head. She quickly took her hands away and looked around at the rest of her friends. With horror she realized each one had a shotgun strapped behind their heads, a string connecting to a pressure plate on their seats. She started trembling, realizing how close she was to shooting herself in the head. All her friends would have woken up to her exploded head everywhere. They all knew that they could easily lift their ass off the seat while they were asleep and kill themselves without noticing, so she turned back to Izuku, feeling more scared and desperate than before. Deku, please wake up. He whipped his head up and smashed it into the gun behind him, leaving blood on the shiny metal where his head made contact. He moaned in agony, his head hanging on his chest, and Uraraka thought he had passed out until she heard him begin his renowned mumbles. She screamed, waking him up so quickly. Why would a chain be used to restrain me? Did they believe quirks cannot break it? The chair beneath me must be made of metal because it feels cold. My last memory is of waking up in the truck and seeing All Might grab hold of me. And before that I saw, his eyes grew and shot his head up looking around the table, his face grew with worry. His eyes went around the table till he locked eyes with Uraraka and gasped, Uraraka. Are you okay? Are you in pain? He froze in terror as she screamed, unable to form words quickly enough. Your cheek and forehead have bad gashes on them. She saw bright yellow hair shoot up panically beside Deku. Whatever you do, no one lift off your chairs. They will kill you with their guns aimed at all of our heads. Immediately, she saw both of their faces droop. Where the hell are we guys? Kaminari asked, looking around in fear. I have no idea. All I really remember is seeing the villain outside the window and Deku taking the bullet for me as the villain tried to shoot and kill me. Quote. Uraraka shakes her head. The last thing I remember is Mr. Aizawa screaming to get down after a gunshot went off and the bus blew up. She looks down at her lap, tears in her eyes. Then Iida was holding us both as the bombs went off. Kaminari looks at Izuku with concern. Dude, you're shot. Are you okay, dude? Izuku nodded and told the electric boy that he was okay, and Kaminari grinned and said, taking a bullet for your girlfriend's pretty cool, dude. They both turned red and stammered as they tried to deny it, and the noise woke up a very irate Bakugo. Oi, Bakugo looked around, glaring, what the shit is going on? Some of us are trying to sleep USH hits, he screamed, waking up more people. He touched the gun with his head leaned back and exclaimed, what the shit? I have the fuck behind me. Looked at him, Uraraka said, Bakugo, please stop shouting. Keep your seats, everyone. A shotgun pointed at your head will be activated if you remove enough of your body weight. Yaoyorozu glanced around the table and said, wait, where are Iida, Mineta, Shiro, and Sato? Everyone appeared terrified beyond belief, with some even cautiously reaching out and touching their guns. Izuku and Kirishima both appeared nauseous as he asked, drawing everyone's attention to themselves. Iida was on the bus. I was dragging Midoriya out when the whole thing collapsed on Iida. He simply grinned about it. Everyone appeared either appalled, or in tears, as Uraraka had started. Their friend was dead, and they all felt terrible because that's what happened to the other 3 missing people as well. All right, are they dead? That isn't possible. Perhaps they succeeded. It's possible that they are currently free and unarmed after surviving. Hagakure says, the sleeves of her shirt lifting as her arms did. Everyone just nodded silently, praying that's what happened. Oi, we were being observed. Most likely the villain who attacked us, Bakugo said, pointing to a camera with its light on. The students looked around and noticed that there were numerous cameras capturing every angle. This either means we're all alone or he's nearby, Todoroki sighed. In an attempt to get a better view of his unglossy surroundings, Aoyama looked around. No one had time to react because it happened so quickly. Aoyama's leg lifted as he twisted his body to look behind him. The rest of the class let out a horrified scream as his head exploded from the flash and loud bang of the bullet. More of his insides were splashed onto the table when his body fell onto it. The majority of his blood was spilled on Ishido and Koda, who were seated on either side of him. Everyone stared after the initial shock subsided while some of the girls sobbed. And no way, Aoyama, Kirishima trembled deathly. Well, that sure is one way to start the show, said their now dead friend as a loud clapping suddenly came from behind them. The man who walked up was immediately identified as the one from the bus attack, still wearing only black. He entered the light, his red eyes glowing in the darkness. Bakugo screamed, "You fucker. You just killed our friend. I'll kill you. You hear me?" But the class noticed that his screams to the villain were much quieter than his usual ones directed at them. They were his friends, then. Midoriya had been correct. He simply struggled to express his feelings. The villain laughed and came over to him, patting him on the shoulder. "You sure do have spunk, but let this be a warning. If you move from your chair, you're dead. If you try to use your quirks, you're dead. That disgusting mess over there is our 7th victim. I can't wait to see who's next." After he was done, he placed a gun down on the table in front of Bakugo. "Now, take this gun and shoot someone sitting around the table. But do realize if you even aim it at me, you're dead. As well as the rest of the players of the game." Bakugo paled at his words. "Fuck that. No way in hell would I kill someone. Unlike you, I am not a villain." The villain just laughed. "Here is how our game is going to play out. One by one this gun will be passed around the circle, and one by one you will kill each other. Of course there is the option of shooting yourself. You will be given an hour time limit. After that time, if you haven't killed anyone, you yourself will die in one of the slowest, most painfulest deaths of your life. So young man, make your choice and shoot." He yelled into Bakugo's ear, causing him to jump. The villain had put the gun in the young man's hand while he was speaking. Bakugo's hands automatically pulled the trigger, striking Ojiro in the chest. As the man coughed up blood and collapsed onto the table, everyone screamed and gawked. 2 down, 13 more to go, grinned the villain. As her son drops the gun onto the table, clutches his hair, and screams in agony, Mitsuki Bakugo could only look at the screen in utter horror. To be able to hold her baby boy in that moment would be her greatest desire. Neither she nor her husband had ever witnessed his extreme pain. She turned to see a man with a tail clutching his yelling wife as they were being dragged from the room after hearing screams behind her. Sitting on the floor, a woman who bore a striking resemblance to the young boy who was killed first was sobbing into her knees. As the police struggled, she saw her old friend get up and assist the poor woman in getting to her feet. As she led the poor woman to the kitchen, she heard Inko whispering something to her about getting her some tea there. Mitsuki glanced up at her husband, who was crying uncontrollably and keeping his gaze fixed on their yelling son. She wiped them away carefully and drew him in while crying. When a cup of tea appeared, she felt a hand lightly brush against her shoulder. Wiping her eyes, she took the next drink that was offered and gave it to her sobbing husband. With a sorrowful smile and a nod, her friend picked up her tray and distributed the remaining ones to everyone in the room who requested one. "Thank you, Inko," she said. Before saying, "Our children would want us to take care of ourselves. They wouldn't want us to become dehydrated." She placed the remaining items on the room's table and sat down with a cup. A man threw his tea to the floor, breaking the cup, and everyone in the room jumped. "How can we just sit back sipping tea, and watch our children kill each other one by one?" Quote, he cried, the same man who had assured Mrs. Todoroki that his daughter would defend her son. The room fell silent, and Mitsuki was triggered by the heartbreaking expression on Inko's face. Hey, she was just trying to help everyone. Everyone is upset and horrified. I just watched my baby shoot and kill someone. Now we all have to listen to him screaming as his mind breaks. Inko's son is in there as well, yet she's doing everything she can to assure us all. She's more like your daughter than you are. She's thinking of others while you just shattered your daughter's cup. She yelled, pointing to the broken glass. When the man saw the carved name inside the shattered glass, his face fell. Kyoka Jiro is neatly written by his baby girl, with musical notes at either end. As his tears fell into the tea that had spilled, he knelt down and picked up the pieces with care. I am sorry. He could only nod while sniffling and staring at the cup as Inko, who was sitting on her knees next to him, helped clean up the mess. She shook her head and used her peculiarity to pick up the small pieces of the cup and place them in his hands. We know you're upset and worried, and you have every right to be. Just, maybe try to remember that everyone in here has a child beside your daughter, she said. To put the pieces in, his wife brings over a tiny sandwich bag. After giving the short, green-haired women a nod, she led her husband over to their seats. When the villain's hollow voice started talking, they all looked at the screen. Nobody was aware that the Bakugo screams had ceased. Instead, they had simply been replayed in their minds. As he pointed to the left of where Bakugo was seated, he said, "Now, let me explain in more detail how our game's going to play." Since this young man running his mouth off got him volunteered to begin the game, this will be the starting point. Every parent's anxiety increased as they watched their kids' frightened faces. He placed the gun in front of Asui and said, "The line will go like this. First Asui, then Kota, Ashido, Shoji, Todoroki, Hagakure, Kaminari, Jiro, Tokiyami, Yaoyorozu, Kirishima, Uraraka, and then Midoriya. After him the circle repeats until all but one remains," he said, walking around the circle and placing a hand on each person's shoulder while he said their names. As some of their kids threw what little they had in their stomachs onto the floor next to them, the parents could only watch. The frog-like man stood up and demanded that a policeman take his kids out of the room. The kids screamed and objected, and the woman officer took them both away. He genuinely didn't want the kids to witness their sister's death and knew his daughter couldn't murder a friend. He watched as the gun was placed in front of their daughter while standing next to his sobbing wife. Bright red numbers appeared as the villain gestured toward a wall. The joy in his voice chilled everyone to the bone as he said, "This clock will count down from an hour, giving each of you an hour to decide who you would like to kill. If the timer hits 0, then you yourself will die slowly and painfully for a whole hour, making your friends all watch." No one anticipated that Todoroki would stare straight at the camera, as though he were looking at the parents sitting in their dorm house. "What are the cameras for?" Tokiyami asked, his eyes widening. "You plan on making our parents watch us be killed?" The villain nodded, his smile never leaving his face. "That's for the whole world to view your little game. It's on live right now. The world has been watching everything that's happened so far. 2 families have already witnessed the murder of their children," he says, pointing to the 2 dead bodies scattered across the table. "Say hello to the children of the parents." The parents assumed something on their end indicated which one was filming, and mommy. As they saw their kids all turn their heads to the camera they were watching through. Daddy. Uraraka's parents almost burst into tears at the sound of their daughter's voice. She sounded so tired, so broken. The villain once again smiles, his voice snapping the children's gazes from the camera to the man. "Oh, by the way, police. Every time one of these kids dies, I'll give away a clue as to where we are, just to add intrigue." The parents gulped. "A clue? That means they will get closer to locating Tama at the expense of one of their lives, though." So, as the children's fear spreads, the villain yells, his smile growing crazier, "Everyone knows the rules. Now let's start the games. Stop this." Kirishima couldn't take it any longer and glared at the villain, but because of his fear, the glare wasn't as fierce as he would have liked. Asui stared at the gun, her entire body racked with fear. Bakugo had completely shut down beside her from his turn, and she couldn't stop the tears from streaming down her face. She had never touched a gun and she never wanted to. "Don't force her to do this, please. How could we possibly deserve this?" The villain remained seated behind a glass wall and turned to face the boy. "If you want to spare her the trouble, then please be my guest and lift your ass up," he said. The redhead flinched as he yelled. When Asui noticed that the timer was moving too quickly for her, she slowly put her hands on the gun and heard some gasps, including Hagakure, who was still crying after Ojiro was killed. Izuku surprised the class by saying, Asui, you can shoot me." And they all turned to face him as if he had just sprung out of his wings. He went on to say, "The more of us that die, the more chances there are of the rest of you surviving. Since they've already killed 2 people, they must already have 2 clues, right? Furthermore, the villain did not confess to killing Mr. Aizawa, and he is not present with us. That implies he is still alive. He is searching for all of us, including our teachers, and the police are currently looking for us. If we wait until the last minute to use the gun, that just gives more time for the rest to be rescued, he says, turning his head to face the clock that is ticking down. That jolted Bakugo out of his reverie. So why in hell must you be the one to pass away, Deku? I should be the one, Kaminari said, but if we follow that trend then we might as well kill ourselves. He started to shake once more and turned to face the corpse across from him. No one should have to die in the first place, Shoji said, turning to face everyone. We're members of the most prestigious school for heroes, UA, Class 1A. This should be something we can work out. The more they thought along those lines, the more hope filled their chests. Yaoyorozu smiled slightly, feeling it was her responsibility to keep the class spirits high. Right now as we sit here, All Might is probably searching high and low with Mr. Aizawa and the whole police force for us, she said, as everyone nodded, allowing Shoji's words to sink in. They'll track us down. As our vice class president, I can't just sit back and let everyone be so depressed. Iida would be throwing his arms at you all for losing hope, she said, looking around the table. We can't allow ourselves to fall into the ways of the scum villain that has taken us. We will not allow the sacrifices made by those who have already lost their lives to be in vain. The class nods in agreement and starts looking around, trying to think of a way out of this mess. They all jump when a loud buzz goes off, and as they look at the clock, they realize they only have 30 minutes left before someone else is killed. Everyone who had been crying has now stopped and is only displaying pure determination on their faces. Izuku was too busy studying the room, trying to see past the bright lights to see if there was a vent or a window, anything to help them. Asui stares at the gun in her hands, wondering if she is in a nightmare or if she will wake up from it when the timer hits 0. She looks at her green-haired friend, who was willing to give up his life if it meant one of his friends had an extra hour to live. Jiro was the first to notice the frog girl raising the gun at the boy, gasping in panic, "Asui, what are you doing?" That caught everyone's attention, and they all turned to watch the girl slowly point the gun at their friend. Izuku looks to see, and his eyes widen when he sees the all-too-familiar sight of the gun aimed at him. His hero instincts take over, and he does the last thing any of them expected him to do. He gave her his biggest smile. "It's okay, Asui, you have no other option." He looked at the camera sorrowfully as tears streamed down his cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Mom. Please remember that." He smiled through the tears once more, trying to be brave as his classmates yelled at her to stop. "Please, Asui, there must be another way. Don't do this, Asui. Refrain from firing." Deku. The firearm discharged. All Might had been sitting in his car for the last hour as he drove to the hospital where Aizawa was staying. Aizawa had called to ask All Might to come sign him out because he knew more than anyone how much the students meant to him. Aizawa has repeatedly stated that he would gladly die for his students, and this time he almost did. Aizawa and Present Mike had expelled a whole class from school last year because he didn't like them, and this time he almost died for them. He wondered if Aizawa was watching the live broadcast because it looked like everyone was glued to a screen. When All Might got to the hospital and parked, he started filling out the release papers at the front desk. Since he was the #1 hero, the doctors and nurses didn't need an ID from the blonde, so anyone could quickly recognize him. After completing the forms, he proceeded to the room where Aizawa and Present Mike were under strict guard. After receiving permission to enter, he opened the door to the sound of the TV blaring the news channel and filled in the world on what was going on with Class 1A. He saw Aizawa sitting in a wheelchair next to Present Mike's bed, looking sadly at his longtime friend. Aizawa appeared to be dead, as he should have been after being shot in the head. His head and most of his body were still wrapped tightly, and he had a large oxygen mask strapped to his face to help with his labored breathing. Given that the man had been in a coma for 8 days, Aizawa expressed much more fatigue than All Might had anticipated when he saw the elderly man standing in the doorway and pointed to the TV, asking, "Have you been watching the feeds?" If this is how the man in the wheelchair approached him initially, something must have happened because All Might shook his head in fear of what he was about to hear. "No, I came as soon as I hung up on you after you called to come get you," he said. Aizawa nods. "I didn't want to be a distracted driver." She then turns to face the man and asks, "Were the kids awake when you last watched?" Aizawa turns back to Present Mike as All Might shakes his head. All Might's chest froze as he said, 2 more have died since you last saw them. But how? Why? Who? All Might didn't realize he was speaking aloud until Aizawa responded to his inner questions. Aoyama got up from his chair, setting off a shotgun strapped behind his head. Regarding the second, they are 15-year-old children. The villain made Bakugo shoot Ojiro. All Might looked angry, more angry than Aizawa had ever seen. Even for a villain, this is disgusting. This is blatantly cruel. Aizawa nodded in agreement. The villain told the children and the rest of the world that they had to go around the circle with a gun and shoot themselves or someone else. They have an hour limit. If they don't pick someone, they gradually perish for an additional hour, making everyone watch. Additionally, a clue to each deceased student's location will be made public. How could anyone have created such a stale game? No human being, that much is certain. They sat silently, thinking about the students, and after 20 minutes, they finally started talking again. All Might couldn't agree more. You mentioned that the police already had 2 clues, All Might said, turning off the television and turning to face his friend. Aizawa nodded as the blonde went behind him and began to push him into the hall. As they passed the security, one grabbed All Might's shoulder. Wait, you both need to hear this. As he handed the device to Aizawa, he turned up the volume on his phone so that both men could hear it better. The screen displayed the live broadcast, which showed their dead and alive students seated around the table. It was All Might's first time seeing the dead students, and he instinctively covered his mouth. Then they heard Yaoyorozu's surprisingly powerful voice. Right now as we sit here, All Might is probably searching high and low with Mr. Aizawa and the whole police force for us. They'll track us down. The guard retrieved his phone and grinned, saying, even your students know you're coming for them, so hurry up and do so. We can't allow ourselves to fall into the ways of the scum villain that's taken us. Aizawa and All Might were shocked to learn that their students were waiting for them and that they all knew they were coming, but the worst part was that they weren't. Instead, they were just getting started. All Might, bring these kids home. Eraserhead. All guards did a salute to the 2 men who were speechless. All Might smiled and noted, of course we will. Until we are certain they are safe, we will not give up. Aizawa gave a nod of agreement. Everyone in the hall moved out of the way as All Might started pushing Aizawa's chair down the hall once more. They were going to take their students home and make sure everyone was safe, but as soon as all the hope was gone, it was shattered and replaced by a sickening feeling when voices shouted from the guard's phone, which was still playing the live feed. Asui, don't do this. Refrain from pulling the trigger. Deku. Followed by the echo of a gunshot going off. All Might stopped walking, his legs going weak. No way this couldn't be. Izuku Midoriya, his student, his son, was just killed. All Might didn't know when or how he ended up on the floor, on his knees behind the wheelchair. But he was literally slapped back to reality, courtesy of Aizawa himself. If you shut down now, then the rest of the students will die. They're all anticipating our arrival. You will be held accountable for the deaths of the other students if we don't go to the police station to assist in the search for them. All Might, everyone knows how special Izuku was to you, he said, his voice growing softer as he looked at the man. You hear me, he wouldn't want you to act in this way. All Might immediately understood Aizawa's meaning when she said, he has a mother who is now all alone, she will need someone to watch over her. The woman had nothing left to live for, so All Might had to make sure she didn't do anything she would regret for Izuku. Let's go hunt down these bastards, he said, nodding slowly and standing up, his legs trembling a little as he gazed at the man in the chair, his eyes brimming with fire. Now that's the hero I know, said Aizawa with a slight smirk. They were almost trampled by a man who was hurrying out the door when they got to the police station. Tsukauchi, All Might's friend, was standing with his back to them, staring at a large board that was covered in pictures, news clippings, notes, and string. In the case of Todoroki's, the board had a photo of every student with a big smile on it, or at least a happy look in their eyes. However, on the photos of the deceased, a red X was placed over their faces, and Aizawa's eyes followed each one until he gasped, his eyes widening. All Might must have seen it too, at the same time he did. Hiroshima was the one. I'm glad you both could make it. We need as many people as we can get to crack these so-called clues the villain has supplied us with, Tsukauchi said with a sorrowful smile as he turned to face the 2 stunned men behind him. Realizing that neither of them was in the room with him, he followed their gazes until his stomach dropped. Oh God, did you guys not watch the feed? Aizawa's voice cracked as he said, we heard it. We heard Uraraka yell Deku and the gun go off. Both men slowly turned their heads. Tsukauchi nodded. How did Kirishima, who was seated 2 seats away from Midoriya, get the gun aimed at Midoriya, who allowed her to shoot him? The shotgun then went off, striking him in the back after Kirishima abruptly broke his chain with his quirk and leapt in front of the bullet. He died with his hand extended in the center of the table after the other bullet struck his throat. For his friend, he gave his life. Aizawa read out the clues on one side, which is why they were there, while he stared at the board that read, Clue number 1, Forgotten, Clue number 2, War, Clue number 3, Underground. All Might looked at the wall of pictures, knowing that another student would be killed in another hour or any second, either by themselves or by a friend. These newspaper clippings featured potential villains who could be the red-eyed man who has them, and they were all excellent suspects based on the notes attached to them. After the 3 students left the table, these are the hints that were made public. Tsukauchi nodded, saying, the last one is really helpful, but we haven't been able to figure out much yet. They are underground, as we now know. The only issue is that it could be anywhere underground. As he gazed at the hints, his eyes widened. Could they mean underground war bunker? Tsukauchi gasped and snapped his fingers. It has to. By now, who knows if the students were still in Japan. He started shouting at his team to bring up the locations of all the war bunkers in the nation, and they saw hundreds more than they had anticipated. A woman rushed in grinning and carrying a file, saying, I think I know who our villain is. One of the best things they've ever heard, she explained, it's all in the picture that Izuku Midoriya took. After further analysis, they discovered this. She shows a pixelated photo of a strange logo. It was round with what looked to be a tiger or lion roaring in the middle. Aizawa's eyes widened recognizing it, the Roaring Tiger Gang. Slowly, she nodded. Based on that, we looked at their profiles and discovered a red-eyed man with a peculiar finger-snapping habit. A sound wave is triggered by a single snap of his fingers. Depending on the individual, anyone who gets an earshot will be instantly unconscious for hours. Crimson Blood, the brother of pro-hero Crimson Riot, is the name he always went by. Aizawa concluded, and she simply nodded. Who is this Roaring Tiger Gang? All Might was more than perplexed. Aizawa, do you know them? You don't, he asked, glancing at the man. They were the most vicious and lethal gang on the planet. They ruled for years, but they were killed right away when they were overthrown. I was there the day they were captured and killed, and I witnessed them all being killed. He said, looking down at his clenched fists. Those monsters weren't supposed to live another second after they were finally captured. How on earth are they still alive? The injured man's glare could kill someone. One of the Roaring Tigers killed my younger sister, the last living family member I had, Tsukauchi said, turning to face the man in a wheelchair. Aizawa, I know this is personal, so maybe, and now they are murdering my students. I will go find them myself if you dare to say I'm off this case. Tsukauchi was only able to nod, taking care to keep his distance from the man, before a shout from outside the building cut them all off. Everybody, it's the pupils. They were out of time. Izuku's eyes were enormous, unable to take their eyes off the leaking hole in his friend's neck, and the Class 1A students gazed at their dead friend on the table, stretched out in front of him, with blood pooling around him from both places the bullets had hit him. Asui dropped the gun, tears streaming down her face as she cried, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry, she sobbed with her hands covering her face, saying, I had to, my family needs me. After the shock of it all subsided, Ashido was unable to stop a panic attack that left her gasping for air and shaking her head rapidly. This is too much, she said. I want to return home. Please, we need someone to save us. Please, we do not wish to perish. I no longer want to watch this. Kota quietly tried to help calm her, being as he was sitting beside the poor girl. Kaminari stared at his best friends as the tears wouldn't stop. We just wanted to help people. All we want is to save lives and be heroes. For that, why are we being punished? Uraraka glanced at her best friend, who was in a trance, and cautiously reached over to take his hand in hers. He jumped at the sudden contact, looking at her, and she looked into his glazed-over eyes, saying, it wasn't your fault, Deku, please. Please don't leave me alone. He leaned forward slightly to see around her, looking at Kirishima's now empty chair, and something clicked. Nothing happened when he used his quirk to escape the chain. Was that a bluff to get them to behave? But the shotgun did go off, which could have been him jumping off the chair rather than him using his quirk as well. Izuku didn't realize he was mumbling aloud until he heard a rough whisper next to him. "You onto something, Deku?" Bakugo's throat sounded raw as he asked, probably from screaming after it had happened. With a small nod, Izuku returned the whisper, "Did you see the shotgun go off?" Bakugo simply shook his head and said, "It happened so fucking fast." Izuku nodded, acknowledging that everything had happened in an instant. He glanced around the table and said, "Ashido, please, you need to calm down and take a breath. All of us must relax and clear our minds. Our families and loved ones are waiting for us at home as All Might and Mr. Aizawa arrive. So we're Kirishimas, and they just witnessed the murder of their son. This is it, Midoriya, face it." Everyone unconsciously turns to face the camera as Kaminari says, "We're all going to die here. Do you believe they are actually observing us?" Ashido asks in a low voice, and Tokiyami nods and turns to face the girl. "Of course they are, and right now they are wishing they could be here to tell you to calm down as well," Todoroki said, looking into the camera. "I wonder if my mother even knows what's happening to me, or if my bastard of a father cares." Izuku gave him a kind smile, saying, "I'm sure she's watching you right now, quietly cheering you on." Todoroki smiles lightly at that. He was just re-establishing contact with his mother, and he didn't want that to end abruptly. "Isn't your father the number 2 hero Endeavor? Why would you call him a bastard? He looks really cool on TV," Shoji says. "He's worse scum than some villains." Todoroki shakes his head. When his son was born with both quirks, he carefully touched the scar on his face, recalling the day he received it from his mother after his father had pushed her too far. "He gave me this scar, and blamed it on my mother," he said, recalling how he forced my mother into marriage and made her attempt to create the perfect weapon to surpass All Might. Locking her up, knowing that everyone was looking, he makes a last-ditch attempt to reveal his father's true nature in the hopes that it will prevent his siblings from suffering at his hands. After a moment of silence at the table, everyone turned back to the camera and said, "Hello, Mom and Dad. I cherish you. I want you both to know how much I adore you, if this is all I have for you." Jiro wiped away her tears and said, "And that I stole your good headphones, Dad." Ashido then said, "Mom, I love you so much. And you too, little bro. I would give you a forehead flick right now if I could. Grandma, if you're watching, thank you for raising me and putting up with my stupid ass," she said, laughing as tears streamed down her cheeks. Kaminari grinned. "What you told me not to do, I did." Bakugo looked at the camera and said, "Oi, shitty mom and dad." Quote. He paused, trying to think of the right words to say. "Thank you, for always dealing with me. I fell in love and got myself killed for it," he said, laughing lightly, his face red from blushing. Jiro blushed next to him and muttered, "Sorry Dad, I broke your no falling in love rule. I am aware that I am a jerk. I never merited any of you." Even he couldn't stop the tears from streaming down his face as he added the final line, turning away from the camera. "I love you both." When a loud alarm went off, everyone in the room jumped. At first, they thought that the heroes were coming to their rescue, but when they realized what the sound was coming from, their hearts leapt into their chests and they screamed just as the lightning bolts began to rain down on Kota, who was silently mumbling and making the hand gestures he always loved to do. To everyone's horror, he wasn't dying. They were unaware that the clock had reached 0. Kill before the time ran out, or suffer for an hour, Ashido recalled the rules, but, Asui. "Pass me the gun, please." The frog girl looked at her, fear in her huge eyes but nodded and did so. Ashido was next in line for the gun, and technically the villain didn't say the next person couldn't kill the one who ran out of time. She aimed at Kota, whose body was shaking like she's never seen and pulled the trigger. As soon as Kota hung from his side dead, the lightning stopped. The room was quiet staring at Kota's dead, fried body. Ashido was still holding the gun, she couldn't take her eyes off him. She just killed someone. The villain suddenly started laughing loudly. "You really are smart kids. It appears that you have discovered a rule loophole." As the villain approaches the now dead Kota, he laughs and says, "You really are smart kids. Looks like you found a loophole in the rules." When Ashido realized what she had done, her hands trembled and she dropped the gun onto the table. As she stared, tears streamed down her cheeks. Despite being anxious or in a panic, Kota never spoke. He had frequently assisted the class with their antics. Whether they were using his quirk to help families find their lost pets, rescuing mice from the school, or calming the squirrels that Kirishima and Kaminari let loose in the girls' restroom. He always treated everyone with such kindness. Everyone knew something was bothering him on the one day he didn't show up to class happy. He showed them a tiny kitten he had discovered outside the campus grounds during lunch. Taking in the little fuzzball made the entire class very happy. It took some persuasion for some, mostly Bakugo, to keep him, but the ability to put bomb in his name convinced him. The girls had a great time transforming the kitchen pantry into a cat sanctuary, and Kota was the happiest person anyone had ever seen. Anyone could go visit him there, and no teacher would search the room. The 21st student in Class 1A, Princess Donut Sprinkle Bomb, became a member of the family. Kota cherished all living things. Given how painfully he passed away, he never deserved to die. "Oh sweetheart, was that your first ever kill?" Todoroki glared at him and said, almost growling, "Don't you dare touch her. If it weren't for this sick game you forced us to play she wouldn't have had to do it." This only made the villain smirk even more. "Oh yeah, are you gonna make me?" he said, taking his hand off the frozen pink girl's cheek and turning to face everyone. "New rules. If anyone pulls that stunt again, the entire group will finish the punishment for the person who was supposed to be punished. And I'll make sure none of you die, so you can suffer long and nice. Any other loophole will be treated the same. Got it? Anyone have anything they'd like to ask or say before the game continues?" When it was Shoji's turn, he nodded and reached for the gun. "I have a question, what if the gun runs out of bullets?" The villain asked with a bright smile, as if he had just been asked what his favorite food was. "Very nice question, young Shoji. If the gun runs out of bullets, and doesn't go off to kill one of your friends, it'll come make your shotgun go off to kill you in replacement of a friend. Sound good?" Todoroki glared once more. "So we don't know who's going to get the empty shot. The more bullets shot the more likely it will be you, correct?" Todoroki nodded. "Yep, you sure seem to be getting nervous. What happened to your quiet bad boy act?" Todoroki simply glared. The villain, however, didn't seem to like the silence that followed the new discovery. Can you guys cry or scream or something? I mean, we do have an audience," he said, gesturing to the camera that was blinking around the room as it was being recorded in turns to get the best angle of the kills. I can just imagine the faces on that kid's family after the electricity hit him. Then for her parents to watch her kill someone must have been priceless. I wonder what the world thinks of you all, some heroes you are killing each other off like this. And making a pretty good show at it as well. Midoriya raised her daggers at the antagonist. "You're sick, you know that. You'll regret ever starting this sick twisted game the second All Might shows up." The antagonist chuckles. "Oh please, they will never find you all in time. By the time our game is done and over, they will only find you thanks to the final clue. And by then it will be far too late." The villain nods and smiles. "Oh yeah, you have no idea how much preparation it took for this game to become a reality. I bet the media and the whole world are watching you all kill each other. I sure wish I could have seen the media's reaction to their favorite class being forced into such a game." Shoji nods lightly. "So what I hear is..." Then he lifts the gun and points it at the villain's head, saying, "You have no idea how the media is taking all this, which means you have no connections to the outside, and considering we haven't seen or heard anyone else here, you're completely alone. Also, your threat that if one of us shoots you, you would kill all our friends must be an empty threat. 'Cause then you wouldn't have any game, correct?" The villain's eyes widened as the boy pulls the trigger. There were no more bullets in the gun. Everyone gathered around the table was horrified and kept glancing between their friend and the villain. The villain's voice grew louder and louder until it was nearly intolerable as he started to laugh slowly. He stops laughing abruptly and gives Shoji, who is still pointing the gun at the villain, a menacing smile. "Oh, you are so going to regret that," he says as he slowly approaches the boy in the mask. The other pupils start shouting, pleading with the villain to keep his body away. When the villain took a long knife out of his pocket and twirled the blade between his fingertips, everyone froze. Midoriya gazed at the circled tiger carved on the blade. He was unable to identify the source, but he is certain that he has seen it before. Tokiyami turned to the gunman and said, "Shoji, set off your shotgun." The whole table turned to the bird boy and said, "What?" "But that will." The bird went on, "It will be far less painful than whatever this villain is planning. Can you guys handle watching him be sliced in front of us?" Hagakure has already completely snapped and hasn't spoken a word since this game began. Yaoyorozu bit her lip and drew blood, then turned to the villain and said, "Please? Let me take his punishment. With everyone staring at her, Uraraka shook her head and gripped her hair, and it was clear that she was gradually losing her mind. They would all acknowledge that they were losing their sanity if they were being honest with one another. Eventually, they would all lose it. The villain hummed loudly while glaring down at the boy as he arrived at Shoji. He lowered himself until his face was just inches from the boy's own. Now, how should I chop you up? I guess I could do it the same way I did the other two boys, but what fun is that? I want to make sure you can't even be recognized, he said. Shoji was so angry. Other two boys? You mean Siro and Sato? The antagonist giggles. Yep. And boy, you should have heard their screams. It was beautiful. Of course I left a major clue as to what's happening to you all after I killed them. Let's just hope for the finalists' sake they figure it out in time. As she abruptly wrapped one of his tentacles around the villain, pressed their heads together, and raised his leg, Shoji made eye contact with Midoriya and gave him a slight nod. Nobody could have predicted that Shoji would attempt to eliminate the villain along with himself when the shotgun blasted loudly through the unexpected room. The villain collapsed, motionless, on the boy's lap. After the villain remained motionless for a few minutes, Todoroki was the first to say, Is it all finally over? Uraraka's eyes welled up with tears when she realized, we get to go home. Everyone's hopeful hearts were crushed when a laugh that was all too familiar reverberated throughout the room. I sure did not see that coming. Damn that kid. That hurt a lot. Bakugo snarled at the villain as he slowly removed himself from Shoji's lap, his head dripping blood. How the hell are you alive after that? The villain gave him his trademark crazed smile. Guess the bullet hit my steel plating in my skull. If it was a few inches to the side I surely would have died, Bakugo said. The villain extracts several bullets from his pocket. Reloading the gun, he picked up the blood-stained weapon. The villain then walked back behind the glass, grinned, and started the timer while wiping the blood from his face. Let's continue this game now, shall we? He said, placing the gun in front of the icy hot user and patting him on the shoulder. You're up next, pretty boy. Back in the Class 1A dorm house, the parents watched their children's torture on a large screen. Behind the couches where the families were seated, the police stood ready to assist in escorting the next victim's family outside. The parents sympathized with the officers because, as human beings, they shared their frustration with the entire situation. However, the police had to put on their courageous, tough exteriors. But as the kids bid their loved ones farewell, a young woman in uniform couldn't stand it and started crying. She was removed by the police, and a tall man soon took her place. The candlelight ceremony was cut short when the live feed started because the school grounds were once again evacuated. There were no people on the streets, and the entire city felt like a ghost town. Stores were closed and the parks were deserted. Around that blood-stained table, everyone was inside their houses watching Class 1A members murder one another. The parents of the recently deceased family members were driven from the dorm house to the police station by one of the lone police cars that was visible on the road. His mother halted the escort of Koda's family and took Ashido's mother's pink hands. She expressed gratitude to the pink woman for her daughter's efforts to protect her son from suffering. As the police removed them, her husband put an arm around her trembling body and supported her. Not before expressing gratitude to the pink woman and her spouse. With her fist clenched so tightly that her nails dug in, breaking the skin, Mitsuki gazed at the screen. She detested feeling useless almost more than her son did, and it broke her heart to see her son's eyes gradually lose their luster. She nodded and sighed, I just hate having to sit here and do nothing. He needs me and I'm not there for him. Her husband forcibly removed her hands from the tiny balls for the 100th time that night and gently wiped away the blood. We need to be strong for him. You can't help him if you're hurt, honey, he said. The foolishly named cat leaps up in front of her, pawing at her hands and meowing softly. With a small smile, she drew the cat onto her lap and petted him while he purred loudly. The woman sagged against her husband as the purr gradually lulled her to sleep. With a sad expression on her face, Inko Midoriya laid a blanket over her friend and the sleeping cat. Inko smiles and nods, it's not a problem, I guess my crying could be seen as unnatural. She should get as much rest as she can for now, we'll wake her up if... Masaru Bakugo looked at her and smiled kindly, gently stroking his sleeping wife's hair. Thank you. She isn't used to crying this much in such short of time, he said, not wanting to say it himself. The fact that this was all real seemed so unbelievable. In their hearts, they were all waiting for their kids to come out and ask them how their movie was. However, reality wasn't as pleasant as they had hoped. All of the parents were present when Shoji gave his life in an effort to eliminate the villain. The police arrived and escorted Shoji's family out of the room after the villain rose and returned to his hiding spot. The room was gradually getting smaller. 5 kids had been killed since the game started. However, that does not include the first 4 people who perished on the day of the accident. Only 11 of the 20 students were still alive, and nobody knew who would come next. The worst part was waiting. They all sat for nearly 6 hours hoping their child wouldn't be the next to be killed. Seeing the kids start to lose their temper is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of it these days. They all appeared more exhausted than before, with some appearing to be on the verge of losing it all or losing their minds. The children were beginning to volunteer to be the next victims, pleading for their deaths. Mrs. Todoroki broke when she saw her son on the screen. Thanks to Inko, she is sitting in a tight ball with a blanket wrapped around her, gazing at the screen. She wouldn't listen to anyone who tried to speak to her. Her baby boy's cries pleading with the man not to murder his friends were all she could hear. At one of the tables in the room away from the screen, a woman with pink cheeks had been writing on a piece of paper for quite some time. She then went to the other people with the paper and said, "I think they can use their quirks." When the red-haired boy used his, it didn't set off his gun. Also, they are alone with just one villain. The latest boy just cleared that up. Maybe the police haven't realized his yet. Maybe we could be doing something for our children after all. A strange-eyed woman smiles and nods. We could help them catch on to any needed clues as to where they are. Our children are smart. They may even know this already. Mrs. Uraraka nodded, smiling just like her daughter used to say. Yes. Let's all pitch in and help save our children. It would be an understatement to say that Aizawa was irritated. Aizawa has spent the entire hour attempting to persuade the Class 1B students to leave the police station since they arrived an hour ago. This isn't some game like the villain is saying. Those students are actually dying. If you get involved, are you willing to risk being next around that table? A boy he remembers by the name of Tetsu stood his ground, crossing his arms. Hell yeah, we are. We're training the heroes and our friends are in danger. How are we supposed to just sit around and watch? Aizawa sighed, shaking his head. I am calling Blood King to come get you all. The kids gasp and begin to argue again, making Aizawa snap. Sitting in his wheelchair, he reaches up and pulls up his bandage, showing the gory not yet healed bullet wound right above his temple. Look. Is this really what you want? Don't stay out of this. This is what will happen to all of you. Allowing a whole class to be abducted is already a bad impression on UA. Allowing another class to put themselves in danger is unacceptable. A serious-looking girl with a red side ponytail approaches and says, even though we belong to different classes, we're all in this together. You cannot make us go. There must be something we can do to help, please. All Might approaches his distressed friend from behind and puts his bandages back on his head. Are any of you tech-savvy, kids? Would you be able to assist the hacking team in breaking into the live feed and determining its source? All 3 students turned their heads staring at Monoma. He quickly shot his hand up. I am, sir. I understand that our classes have conflicted with yours, but let's make amends and preserve the ones we can. A police officer comes and leads the young man into a room filled with computers, where the team was working their hardest. All Might turned to the other 3 students. What skills do you 3 have to offer? Tetsu gestures to the girl with the red hair and says, Kendo is very intelligent when it comes to puzzles and that. Shiozaki also sees things that others would miss. Everyone may nod, saying, good, and you? The silver-haired boy grinned and said, I'm good at supporting other people. All Might slapped the man in the shoulder and turned back to the students, saying, go look on the board and see what you can figure out. There are some pretty graphic photos on there just to warn you all. Aizawa grunted physically at this. Go home, you're useless to us. They are just trying to help, and since we have no leads, it's a smart idea to bring in other minds and eyes, said Might, who looked at the black-haired grouch as the students all lit up and nodded as they ran to the board. Aizawa rubbed his face and said, I know, I just want them safe. They might realize something we haven't. All Might understood what he meant when he said, you're blaming yourself, thinking that if you could remember then a clue would come to you. Aizawa remained silent, which only served to validate All Might's assertion that, Aizawa, he started, but was interrupted by a loud argument in the room containing the information board. Both men entered, closing the door so as not to disturb the rest of the building, and asked, what is going on in here? Tetsu gestures to Kendo, who is visibly agitated. She believes that the object in the circle is a tiger. All Might yells, his hands on his hips, when a lion is clearly present. What a metalhead you are. She glared at him. They've even written that it's a tiger. Aizawa sighs before throwing a can that was beside him at them. Enough. It represents the gang of roaring tigers. We've already worked that out. Just shaking his head, Tetsu said, no, I'm telling you. This symbol is on the door of an old house close to my neighborhood. The man with the scarface told me it was a lion when I asked what it was. Aizawa's eyes grew wide. Wait. Was the man with the scars have dark hair? Had a hint of green in it? Tetsu had just subscribed to the leader of the roaring tiger without realizing it, and the scar on his face was probably from the execution he went through, the same execution that should have killed him and his entire gang. The boy nods, looking perplexed. Before he could ask any questions, Aizawa had him write down the address. He and the police force could never forget that dark-haired man. Why make a reappearance after all these years? With a few papers in his hands, a policeman bursts into the room. Sorry to disturb any of you, he said, looking dejected as he reached up and pinned up 2 new clues and took pictures of Shoji and the new victims with the red tape crossing them. As he finished, the room fell silent, and he pointed to Shoji and said, the kid tried to shoot the villain, but the gun was out of bullets. Then he drew the criminal within range of his shotgun and fired it. But it appears that the villain's life was spared because of metal plates in his skull. Because of his intelligence, the child told us that the villains are isolated and have no communication with the outside world. Additionally, All Might nods slightly and gently pats Aizawa's shoulder, the same one he struck just moments before, stating, your students are fighters, they're figuring stuff out before us. The villain does not intend to kill every student at once in order to prolong the sick game. Yes, but there are only 10 left, Aizawa said, nodding and staring at the faces with crosses and those without. A second police officer enters with 2 more papers, pins up the most recent clues, and places a cross on the newest victims. It happened right after she got the gun. Things are getting really ugly really fast. She says. Shoto Todoroki stared at the gun. He had no idea how they worked, and he had never in his life thought he would need to, especially to kill one of his friends or himself. Midoriya jolted him out of his reverie with the words, 30 minutes left. Quote. Yaoyorozu sat almost alone on her side of the round table, surrounded by the dead bodies of Kirishima, Ojiro, and Aoyama. He had no idea what to do. How could he just take someone's life away, and his only option was to kill himself, knowing that there wasn't much waiting for him outside and that he would undoubtedly be burned to death after outing his father, whom he had never spoken to because of his father's rules. He lifted the gun to his head, eyes closed, ready to pull the trigger. I apologize, Mama, Papa, Samadare, and Satsuki. I cherish you. I can't do this anymore. The tears ran down the frog girl's face, before lifting herself off the chair, setting off her gun. Her body fell forward onto the table, adding to the chunks that scattered around the table. Todoroki, as well as the whole class, stared wide-eyed at her body. She had been so quiet, only to speak to say her goodbyes, then she was gone. Kaminari's shaky voice pulled Todoroki out of his thoughts. Todoroki put down the gun. Quote. He hadn't even realized he still had the gun to his head. He moved it away slowly and stared at it before sliding it over to where Hagakuri's invisible body sat. No one could tell if the poor girl was still awake. She had barely spoken or done anything since Ojiro was killed. Bakugo sure as hell wasn't expecting the gun to be picked up fast, aiming right at him. This if for Ojiro. Bang! The gun goes off as Bakugo does a face plant onto the table in front of him, his entire cheek and ear blown off. Everyone screamed when it happened. The clock hadn't even been reset yet. Hagakuri, how did you accomplish that so quickly? Are you not even aware of what you just did? You didn't even warn him, and now Kacchan is dead. If she had been visible, they would have seen her arrogant face as Izuku sobbed, tears streaming down his cheeks. He killed Ojiro without warning. He wasn't worthy of dying. I'd rather not die. If I must kill, Thina, bang, Kaminari squeezed the trigger, aiming directly at her head. If the bullet he fired killed her, the shotgun that was activated as she leapt from the shot did. Kaminari was clearly shaking, saying, she lost it. I apologize. She sounded like a villain. It's okay. We know Kaminari, Jiro said, carefully reaching out and taking one of his hands and gently massaging it as he sobbed. We are aware. Izuku, who was still crying, saw a movement out of the corner of his eye and stared in shock for a moment before understanding what it meant. Then he leaned over and closed his eyes as though he was sleeping. Deku, Wake up, Deku, Uraraka screamed, pulling on the hand she has yet to let go of. Izuku didn't change. Hey, our friend, Mr. Villain, needs assistance. There's a problem. From the table, the villain's snort could be heard. Honey, all of your friends need help. When he went to sleep, Tokiyami looked at him and said, he won't be much entertainment. Wake him up. The villain sighed but proceeded to stand up, stretching as he made his way over. All right. I'll be there. He approaches the boy and gives him a forceful slap on the head, saying, awaken, sleeping beauty. I'm still having fun with you. Izuku smirked and sat up, pressing his back against the chair and covering his face with his arm. Okay. Bakuga's arm leapt to the sky, slapping the villain's back before unleashing his greatest explosions on him, saying, die. When Bakugo slowly raised his head off the table and put his hand on the blown-out cheek, he said, motherfucker, this hurts like a fucking bitch. The class gasped in response to the villain's screams, which were like music to their ears. Bakugo, you're alive, everyone exclaimed. How did you know, Deku? Izuku smiled and said, I understand what his glare meant, and he was giving me the finger. I baited the villain out because he wanted to kill someone. Kaminari laughs, we're going to win this death game, guys. Uraraka smiles at the thought of returning home, even though it feels like a lifetime has gone by since she was there. Jiro smiles, we're actually going to make it home. Congrats kids, you just unleashed a whole new kind of hell upon yourselves. A short man with tattoos all over his face and body walked into the light with a slow clap that reverberated through the room. His hair was styled in a pointy blue mohawk, and his smirk showed off his golden teeth. Enjoy your next hour of pain, kids. All the students screamed as electricity suddenly shot through their bodies. When Mitsuki awoke, her husband was shaking her violently and yelling, wake up, it's Katsuki. It was her worst nightmare. Oh my god, Mitsuki, she's going to. The sound of the gunshot on the screen interrupted him, and as soon as her husband started shaking her, she sat up quickly, just in time to see her baby get shot in the face. She saw the blood fly from his face as his face struck the table. This had to be a nightmare, right? She was still asleep, and she would wake up soon to discover that she had fallen asleep again, watching a movie with Katsuki, and that his head was also sound asleep on her lap. Yes, that must be it. Her husband sobbed next to her, and Inko and Izuku Midoriya's cries told her it was all too real. She wasn't there to protect her dead baby. The tears came as fast as a tsunami, pulling her knees up to try and hide them. The shaking of her shoulders gave away her sobs. She felt a police officer grab her rather roughly to make her stand. She wiped her eyes and leaned more into her husband's side as he wrapped his arms around her, crying harder than a newborn. Inko couldn't stop crying as well. Katsuki was like a nephew to her. He even calls her auntie even to this day. Well, up to this day that is. The girl who shot and killed her son was soon killed after. She then realized how many students were dead around the table since she had fallen asleep. The tentacle boy and the frog girl were now both gone to this world, as well as the murderer of her Katsuki. As the police were leading them from the couch they were sitting on, she felt the small hand of her longtime friend wrap around her hand. She looked down into the small green-haired woman's eyes. I may be joining you soon. Quote. At first Mitsuki didn't understand. The only reason she would be joining her is if she quickly turned back to see the screen. Her son is passed out, most likely fainted from being so upset. He just watched his childhood friend be killed after all. His messy green hair covered his face, blocking the view to see if he was injured. As they arrived at the doorway leading to the kitchen, they saw the back door open and a car waiting for them. Thinking of her son in the mornings, making his breakfast or getting a snack or a drink of this was where he had spent the last few months. Mitsuki nodded and took a single step before hearing the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She never imagined she would be so happy to hear that single word, the very word she had scolded him for using. The policeman started to drag them toward the exit of the room, causing Mitsuki to let go of her friend's hand. Perish! Was screamed from the screen in the room behind them. Quickly they turned their heads to see their son, their baby boy, alive, blowing up the very villain who was forcing them to play this horrid game. Inko gasps and stands up, looking back to make sure her friend hasn't left yet. When she sees their shocked expressions, both frozen and unable to move. She smiled at them both. He's alive. When the kids did, the room started to celebrate. Motherfucker, this hurts like a fucking bitch. She hears Katsuki yell, making her laugh into her husband. Only Katsuki Bakugo could be shot in the face and survive. Those 2 words had Mitsuki on her knees, crying into her husband who she had dragged down. The room was filled with laughter and hugs, all thinking the game was over, but boy were they mistaken. The parents turned back to the screen to watch a new villain, a one she thought was much scarier, enter the spotlight as they all heard their kids applaud at the same moment. Congrats, kids, a whole new kind of hell has just been let loose on you. Kids, have fun with your upcoming hour of suffering. Suddenly the screams of their children all being electrocuted bounced off the walls. Mitsuki made her way back beside her best friend, closely followed by her husband. It wasn't over yet, their children were going to suffer more now. Her son is losing a lot of blood, now add the pain of the electricity. Neither her nor her husband knew if he could survive in his condition. They stared at the new villain, analyzing him. Where did he come from? He couldn't have been in that room this whole time. Mr. Uraraka suddenly gasped, the electricity is his quirk. Take a look at his fingers. He has been in there all this time, so why wasn't he ever seen? They all squinted to see, and they all gasped at the tiny bolts that resembled lightning around his fingers. With a pained heart, Aizawa watched as the new officer crossed off Bakugo and Hagakure. Immediately after, another officer crossed off Shoji and Asui. 4 students were killed so quickly that only 8 students remained. Tetsu's face must have betrayed how much this was affecting him, because he suddenly started crying. Don't worry, Mr. Aizawa. Is it still possible for us to save them? After all, 8 is better than none. All Might nods, then examines the new and old clues. Together, they now have the following 8 clues: Forgotten, War, Underground, Below, Transport, 4, Closer Than You Think, and File Case. As promised, each clue was given to them at the expense of a child's life, and not just any child, but students who merely wished to become heroes and save others. 8 lives have been lost, and 8 more need to be saved. The door was swung over once more, but this officer was grinning and saying, the villain. He is no longer alive. One of the students who was shot survived and exposed the criminal. Aizawa's eyes widened. They succeeded. He was stupid to believe that a single bullet could kill the explosive boy. His 8 and Ninja students were safe now. All that was left to do was locate them. The chanting and celebrations in the main room abruptly stopped, making the people who weren't in Aizawa's stomach tighten horribly. Since the entire building was so quiet, he could hear his students' sudden screams. The Bog Man understood, and he pushed Aizawa's wheelchair out to the main room where the live feed was being screened. He watched helplessly as his students screamed in agony, some pleading for it to stop. Aizawa heard a voice from the crowd say, "My God, there really is other villains there with them." Quote. He wheeled himself behind the crowd and knocked softly on the door. When a hyperventilating Kendo opened it, he opened it without changing his expression. "May I come in?" She looked confused but nodded and helped the man in the wheelchair into the smallish bathroom, trying her hardest to calm herself down. Once inside, Aizawa grabbed her hands and pulled her down to his height, breath in, then out. "As you do it, try counting to 3, okay?" He watched as the girl did as he said, slowly calming herself from the panic attack. Aizawa pulled her into a hug once she was able to catch her breath. "Just let it out, okay? Yaoyorozu wouldn't want you to force yourself to hide it when no one is around. After the internships, you two became close friends, right?" Kendo nodded before sobbing into the man's shoulder more forcefully than Aizawa had anticipated. "Why they are being punished for wishing to assist others is beyond me. I really wish I had the answer to that question. That's what I've been wanting to know since I woke up." Kendo sobbed into the injured man's shoulder as he gently rubbed her back. I called my mom and dad. They're coming to pick me up," she said, leaning back from the embrace. He made her look at him and shook his head, saying, "Listen, the best thing you can do is be somewhere where she will know you're safe. I don't think I can mentally handle this all, I'm sorry. Nobody here will believe that you're fleeing from anything. You are a 15-year-old girl, even though you are UA students." She nods and smiles slightly, saying, "To be honest, I was always afraid of you, Mr. Aizawa. This is difficult for adults to handle, let alone a close friend of one of the victims. Your worn-out face always gives off a terrifying vibe, but you're genuinely compassionate. I get that a lot from students. I look scary, so my students get used to it," Aizawa says with a little laugh. "There are plenty of more terrifying villains out there." He nods and hands her some tissues as she laughs and looks at her phone. "My parents are here, I should go," she says. "Do you think you can assist me in getting Tetsu to return home?" "He shouldn't be here," she said with a small smile before getting to her feet after kneeling in front of Aizawa the entire time. We both grew up like siblings pretty much because our fathers grew up together, she nodded. Aizawa nods. I'll get my dad to come in and grab him. All Might waits patiently as they open the door, then turns to face his friend and says, Aizawa, this looks really bad, especially in a police station. A book was thrown at All Might's face, and he quickly ducked. Shut up, All Might. I was simply carrying out my duties as a teacher. All Might seemed to become even more worried after hearing this. She should know how to use a restroom since she is 15. He couldn't avoid that book and ended up getting hit in the face. Both of them stopped arguing and turned to face her when Kendo laughed at them. Don't worry, All Might. Mr. Aizawa was just helping me throw a panic attack, Kendo said. With his hands on his hips, All Might lets out his well-known laugh and asks, Aizawa, why didn't you say so earlier? The smaller man could only complain in frustration. Kendo left Tetsu in the room where she had left him, and he remained sitting in front of the board, gazing at the crossed-out picture of a happy Kirishima. She put a hand on the silver-haired boy's shoulder and said, My family made your favorite, let's go to my place and have a bite, okay? They want me to show them the building where I witnessed the leader of the Roaring Tiger enter, he said, shaking his head. She looks at the board and says, even if we don't want to admit it, we are still kids. His voice sounded so sad and hurt. And if I left now Kirishima would probably yell at me for not being manly enough. The rest must be left to the grown-ups. We will only be obstructing their path if we remain. Can you simply write the building's address or show the police the location on a map? My parents are waiting for us outside, so hurry up. Unless you want to be the victim of my dad's peculiarity. Tetsu flinched, remembering the mont's identical quirk to his daughter's. He nods lightly and pulls out a map circling the building. I just hope we aren't too late. Standing on the sidewalk outside the building, they both said, it's so quiet, there isn't anyone in sight anywhere. Kendo says, walking down the sidewalk to where her parents said they were waiting. Crossing in front of an alleyway however, both students were suddenly grabbed and dragged into the alleyway. Their mouths were covered as arms wrapped themselves tightly around them. They were both thrown into a van. They screamed and banged, praying someone would hear or save them. They didn't notice a man sitting in the front driver's seat until he turned to face them both. Please, don't be afraid, I don't plan to harm you. Tetsu gasps before getting in front of Kendo protectively. Kendo, it's him. The Roaring Tigers are led by this man. Oh, so you know who I am? The man asks with a kind smile. That's great, it makes things much simpler. The police had gathered as many heroes as they could for the search, including All Might himself. Aizawa was forced to stay back because of his injuries, but he didn't let that stop him from trying. As soon as they got to the circled location, they recognized the marking on the old wooden door and realized that this was a Roaring Tiger's den, and the boy had been right. The plan was for All Might to burst in first, make sure the area was safe, and then other heroes would follow. Once everyone agreed to the plan, All Might bounded into the building. The entire room was completely empty, and All Might called in the others. When he opened the basement door, he was surprised to see that all the lights were on, so he signaled for some others as they cautiously snuck down the creaky steps. Don't shoot down here, please. I am accompanied by 2 children. A mont's voice startled All Might, but hearing he had hostages he ran the rest of the way down, coming to a halt at the 2 frightened students sitting on a couch with cups of tea in their trembling hands. Kendo and Tetsu looked at All Might and the others then down at the floor in shame. They were embarrassed. They were supposed to be the heroes doing the rescuing, not being rescued themselves. All Might was beyond angry. How dare this man kidnap these 2 students? What purpose did you feel the need to kidnap 2 more children? He shouted to the man. The man was tall, well-built, and had dark hair with a hint of green. Between his eyes, he had a rather large white scar on his forehead, which was messy, like someone had blown open his face and then simply covered the wound with pure white skin. The man must have realized he was staring because he touched the scar, saying, pretty unique EY. I got it from being executed. They must have forgotten that I had a remarkable healing quirk in my staff. All Might was shocked. Weren't these people the ones who had taken young Midoriya and his friends? He walked over to sit next to the 2 students and asked, are you both okay? Please come join us for some tea. The sooner we start talking, the sooner we can rescue the children around that table. They each give a slight, hesitating nod. The gentleman offered him a glass of tea and said, you are all right, aren't you? I take it that you and Izuku are fairly close. Yes, and we were under the impression that you and your men were behind his and his class's kidnapping. All Might takes his tea and nods lightly. I understand how you would see that, but it's a little more complicated than that, he says. We used to be a group that committed atrocities against defenseless people, but after nearly dying, we changed our ways. Now, we treat terrible people with terrible things. However, 4 people wanted to go back to our previous way of life, including the man who had the quirk that allowed us to be revived. They went crazy when I vowed never to harm an innocent person again. They attacked the bus carrying your students a week after they departed. The villain who revealed all the information they required had everyone's attention, and he didn't appear to be running out of it anytime soon. I have files on all 4 men, all about their quirks and weaknesses. Right now, I can tell you that the person who took down the bus is the weakest. He defeated Midnight, a pro hero. That may give you an idea of who you're dealing with. He hands 4 thick files to All Might, who opened the top one. It showed a picture of the red-eyed villain from the photo on the bus. Behind the photo were many papers describing his snapping quirk and all his weaknesses as well as his past crimes. The next file was of a tattooed man with a blue mohawk and golden teeth. The look in his eyes showed he wasn't sane. The man across from All Might smiles. That's an electricity user, he's pretty good at it. He has the ability to absorb lightning bolts during storms and store their energy inside of himself, which he can then release with his fingers whenever he pleases. But he's useless once his bolts run out. You're telling us all of this, but why? What do you have planned for these children? All Might asks, passing the files to a nearby officer. As the officer leaves, someone else says, the building is clear besides this man here. All Might nods, take the kids, no the kids stay, I'm not done with them yet. The man interrupts All Might, who turns to face him. We won't allow you to get close to Tama. He's interrupted again, please. All I want to do is talk to them. I don't want to hurt them. All Might scowls. Why would you like to speak with them? What's causing your defensiveness? All Might tenses but doesn't turn away or blink, so the man sighs, well, there's something I'm not telling you. And what's that? He asks, and the man beamingly responds, I'm Izuku's uncle. My older sister is Inko. The police in the room and the students next to him stared at him, and out of everything that man could have said, that was the last thing All Might could have anticipated. The man looks around and sighs, my name is Zen, and as I've said, Inko Midoriya is my older sister. We were never close because she is much older than I am, and I stopped communicating with her after she married Hisashi. She mailed me updates on how they all were, and pictures of my nephew. Of course, she didn't want to keep contact since I was in a gang of villains, so I never took it personally. Zen, the man, gets up and walks over to a shelf, where he retrieves and hands All Might and the students a photo album. How adorable he is. Hanging over the book, he points to a picture of Izuku as a baby, grinning toothlessly in his mother's arms. Izuku's hair was impossible to tame as a baby, with wild green curls flying everywhere. All Might would likely love to go through the book in any other situation, but at the moment, the baby boy in that picture was slowly losing his life, so who knows how long he has left. Do you have anything that could help us find them? Zen looks sad and shakes his head, saying, no, I'm sorry, but my men and I would like to help. They were only taken in the first place because Izuku and I are related. The least we could do was this. Zen simply sighs, very well, at least take the information I've given you so far. An officer approaches and says, sir, as much as we need the help, we can't turn to the help of villains. However, finding them will be difficult. All Might looks at him and says, oh, and in what way? Zen looks at him and says, observe his peculiarity in the third file. It's been 2 hours since the punishment began, a student about to die. Quote. Zen says, looking at the clock. He and the healer should be hiding somewhere away from wherever they are holding the children. Kendo and Tetsu look sick at the idea, but All Might noticed something that nobody else did. What do you mean punishment? You haven't been watching the live broadcasting, have you? Zen asks him. The boy with the explosive quirk killed the guy you all know as Crimson Blood, blew him to bits after pretending to be dead after taking a bullet through his cheek. Zen sighs when no one on the couch responds. For a long time, the room was so quiet that nobody dared to breathe. Tetsu finally broke the hush by saying, wait. That leaves them to take down just 3 villains. Why not kill the others and end it now? Because they don't know what we do. They don't know anything, Kendo says, glancing at him. With every smile, Zen resembles his nephew more and more. They said they were releasing clues, correct? Let me help you figure out the clues, please. I could assist in locating these men without anyone knowing because I am familiar with their thought processes. All Might would disagree, but he and the others knew that time was running out. Okay, we'll let you help us. Izuku awoke slowly to a muffled sound in the distance, and as he raised his head, his gaze immediately focused on his friend Kirishima's lifeless face, still sprawled on the table in front of him. He gasped and sat up quickly, glancing around to see Uraraka's anxious eyes. What happened? He spoke in a raspy voice, and judging by the expression in her eyes, his entire body ached. We got electrocuted for a whole hour. You weren't moving and I couldn't tell if you were breathing so. Izuku gasped when he saw Tokiyami dead from his shotgun. The poor boy must have set it off while shocked. Todoroki looked at him at the same time his eyes found him, and they both gave each other small nods to reassure each other that they were okay. Ashido was a mess, sobbing into her hands and talking to herself. Izuku couldn't tell if Katsuki Bakugo was breathing or not, but his gaze eventually settled on the seat next to him. Kachin, he asks quietly. When he doesn't get a response he grows louder. Kachin. Kachin, please, not right now. Izuku's tears fell freely down his freckled cheeks as he felt Uraraka's hand tighten its hold on him and he turned to face her, but she shook his head. He couldn't handle the electricity, and Kachin was dead for good this time. Katsuki Bakugo died defending them from one villain, and now he was free from this terrible game. He wouldn't say it aloud, but he was jealous of his childhood friend. Izuku just wanted to be free at this point, regardless of whether he was saved. The new villain with the mohawk steps forward as a voice booms through the room, saying, now that everyone is awake. Well, kids, let's start this game again. Since it appears that a loved one is seated at the table for our next shooter, I'm going to alter the game a bit. He approaches Kaminari slowly, takes out a jagged, sharp blade, and starts pressing it into the scared boy's cheek while grinning at Jiro. Now, shoot someone sitting at this table that's still alive or else I'll kill this boy. He says. The size of Jiro's eyes increased. No, please don't touch him. Kaminari lets out a sharp gasp as the villain drives the blade deeper into his cheek. Once you pull the trigger, I'll let him go. She looked around the table horrified. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't kill any of her friends, so the only thing she can do is kill herself. As she places the gun against her temple the villain speaks up cutting off Kaminari. No, Missy, you're not allowed to take the simple route. Either murder someone seated at this table, or else this boy will perish. I'll kill him right after you if you kill yourself. That's far too cruel, Izuku says, glancing at the villain. She can't possibly make that decision. Kaminari gives her a slight smile and says, Jiro, it's okay if you pick me. Shut up you idiot, I'll think of something. Jiro started crying, which caused Kaminari's to start crying as well. I'm just so glad I got to know you in this lifetime. Looking at her, Kaminari extends his hand and asks, Jiro, would you die hand in hand with me? She looks at him and then at his hand before shaking her head and saying, no, you shouldn't have to die. With only a faint smile, Kaminari said, Jiro, I killed Hagakure. I know you will follow me when I die, so let's both leap from our seats together. I'm ready for my time. Looking at her best friend, the boy she fell deeply in love with, Jiro says, I love you, Kaminari, even in you are an idiot. To the horror of everyone else at the table, she slowly took his hand and nodded, saying, I love you, Kaminari, even in you are an idiot. He laughs and holds her hand tightly, saying, I love you to Jiro, the biggest music freak in the world. They both stared into each other's eyes as the entire room vanished from them as the others screamed, pleading with them to reconsider their actions and offering them an alternative. Slowly, they counted together. 1. The cries surrounding them intensified. 2. They both grinned, delighted to be performing this final act together, and the cries were much louder now. 3. They both got up from the seat, and simultaneously both of their guns exploded, releasing them from the round table. Uraraka screamed, covering her mouth as splatters of blood from both of them fell on her face, but Izuku was too stunned by what he had just seen to notice the blood hitting his face. Would the villain put him and Uraraka in the same predicament? Wow, I certainly didn't notice that. I bet that small gesture of affection was adored by everyone. The next shooter is up now. Izuku placed the blood-covered gun in front of Yaoyorozu, who was the second person to know exactly who they were going to shoot. She quickly picked up the gun and said, I'm sorry, As class vice president and a friend, I didn't protect any of you, before turning to face the camera and saying, "I'm sorry, Mom and Dad." She then placed the gun to her temple and fired it without hesitation, killing herself. There were just 4 pupils remaining: Mina Ishido, Shoto Todoroki, Ochako Uraraka, and Zuko Midoriya. These 4 pupils were the only ones left in Class 1A, and they were all covered in their friend's blood spray. Everyone is psychologically damaged and anxious about becoming the next victim. Todoroki glanced at Uraraka, who was staring at the gun across the table. Izuku's expression begged the pink-cheeked girl not to use that gun against herself when it was her turn to shoot. The villain approached her and said, "I guess it's your turn now, Pink Cheeks. I want to make this interesting, so..." Before drawing his knife once more while still dripping blood from Kaminari's. He puts the knife to his throat and walks away from her to the far side of Izuku. Uraraka turned paler than their deceased companions. "I want you to shoot your boyfriend," Uraraka exclaimed. Fear on his face, Todoroki shook his head quickly. "That's too low even for you, villain. Leave them alone. Uraraka, shoot me instead." The villain simply laughed. "Nope, you don't make the rules." Then he grabbed Izuku's arm and placed it on the table. Then he took another knife and slammed it into Izuku's arm, causing Izuku to scream. Izuku looks at Uraraka and tries to give her the biggest smile he can. "Try and make her defy me again and I will make sure this boy suffers long and hard. His screams will echo inside your skulls until one day you can't take it and kill yourself." He says, It's okay, Uraraka. Please, if I have to die I want you to be the one to do so," he said, his eyes displaying the obvious pain. She shakes her head, sobbing and crying, saying, "No. Deku will escape this, don't worry. Mr. Aizawa and All Might are probably really near. They're going to save us." Izuku looks at her sorrowfully, then shakes her head, saying, "I'm sorry, Uraraka, no one's coming to save us." Her sobs get louder as she shakes her head, saying, "Don't think like that. We have to." His cries of pain are cut off when the villain abruptly dragged the knife out of his arm, nearly severing it in 2. With gasps of pain, Izuku looks at her and says, "Uraraka, since the very first time I met you, I knew I was going to fall in love with you." She wipes her eyes to reveal his green eyes, and he says, "I knew too, the second you saved me you were my one and only hero." Quote. This caused him to flash his trademark bright smile. Uraraka nods and sniffles as he wipes away his tears. "When you leave, will you look after my mom? I don't want her alone." As he begins to slide the sharp knife down Izuku's face, the villain appears to be losing his patience. He fights through the pain by tightly closing his eyes. Uraraka slowly raises the gun with unsteady hands in order to aim it at Izuku's head. In order to graduate together at the top of their class, she had intended to wed him. To move in together and support one another as they advance through the ranks. Naturally, she had plans to make him the greatest hero of all time. She had no desire because she knew she had everything she could possibly want every time she gazed into his green eyes or heard his endearing mumbles. What else would she require? She intended to let Iida organize the wedding and designate her closest friends and classmates as bridesmaids. Even though he consented to it through the laughter, she was certain that Bakugo would be Deku's best man. She imagined a little green-haired child running around the house acting like a hero when they had children together. She was aware that eventually they would both have to watch their child or children leave for school and grow up to be heroes like their parents. They would have each other, but it would be difficult. In order to spend the remainder of their lives together in harmony and contentment, they then moved into the same retirement community when they grew too old. Together, they would live their entire lives. She had always imagined that, but as soon as she pulled the trigger with her finger, that reality would vanish. Deku was initially terrified when he opened his eyes and saw the gun. The fear of dying and abandoning her. However, a fresh sensation of relief strikes him. He was going to be free at last. With tears streaming down his cheeks, he turns as far as the chain will let him and smiles at her. "Don't worry, I'll make sure to give Iida one of your bone-crushing hugs for you. You better live a long and happy life once you're free. Thank you, Deku, for everything. I'll try and live my life for the both of us. And Iida too, of course. And I promise your mom will be taken care of," she says with a smile and a small laugh. He smiles, his tears having stopped. "I love you," makes him feel so calm knowing that the nightmare is about to end. Uraraka smiles back at him while continuing to cry, "I love you too." The bullet's sound didn't register to her anymore. She saw Izuku's head sag forward, the tiny but swift trail of blood running down his face, and the bullet enter his forehead. But it was his smile and the calmness of his face that caught her attention. It appeared as though he was sleeping and would soon awaken. She only heard her Deku's last words. She didn't hear the villain talking or Todoroki's shouting at her. I cherish you. All Might knew something terrible had happened as soon as he got back to the police station. Nobody would look him in the eye. The ground has apparently become very interesting. With a mask and hood to conceal his identity, Zen trailed him closely. The man was the only one who really knew these villains inside and out, but he didn't want to bring him along. No one could decipher the clues if he couldn't. He enters the room with the board and finds Aizawa still in his chair, sleeping at a table. Beside him, a doctor was conversing with an officer. All Might became enraged and said, "Excuse me, doctor, but did my friend agree to be sedated or did you force him? Do you not realize what is happening to this man's children? He's watched 13 of his students die." The doctor turned and shot daggers at the blonde man in response to All Might's question. You were not supposed to take him anywhere away from the hospital, let alone a different city. You signed him out to take him outside the hospital for a walk around the building. That was it. Actually, the number of deaths for students has risen to 17 since you last watched, sir. Only 3 students remain and we are wasting time rescuing them. They are losing hope you're coming, All Might, the officer says, looking at All Might with sadness. How did this occur so quickly? The last person he saw was young Bakugo, who was shot last but survived to kill the villain Crimson Blood. They were running out of time, because that would mean that 4 more students have gone by since then. Zen watched the enormous board with all the faces and hints while he stood back and let the men argue. He walked over and looked it over. He couldn't help but feel bad after looking at the students' crossed out faces. The 4 people who left his group would still be alive if he had killed them rather than letting them go. The crossed-out image of the well-known smile with freckles and wild green hair caught his attention. Everything in his world froze. He had always wanted to meet and get to know his nephew, his little nephew. He left the world and would never come back. Before an officer abruptly appeared in front of him and inquired about his well-being, he was unaware that he had fallen to his knees on the ground. But Zen could only hear his sister's voice on the phone 15 years ago, and he was unable to hear her. She told him the magical words, "You're going to be an uncle," and was so excited that she couldn't stop smiling on the other end. Naturally, this was followed by the statement, "If you get your act together and quit being a villain, you can be in his life." Since so many people depended on him, his sister knew he couldn't just stop. In a sense, villains saw him as a hero, someone they could always rely on in times of need. He provided additional support by constantly ensuring they had enough money and keeping an eye on their house to make sure nothing untoward occurred. He once witnessed Izuku, who couldn't have been older than 2 at the time, slinking away from his mother while she wasn't watching in the marketplace. He kept the toddler at a distance because he knew his sister would be upset if he went to Izuku. He would growl or glare at anyone who approached, forcing them to leave the boy alone. The boy was eventually located by a hero, who naturally recognized the villain for what he was and left the market. He was allegedly attempting to abduct young Izuku, according to the news that evening. He assumed his sister would be upset with him when she called him that evening. She was crying, though, and he could hear Izuku nearby in the background repeatedly saying, "Mommy," in an attempt to soothe her. "Thank you, I know the man they are talking about on the news is you. You were protecting him, weren't you?" Zen smiles at his sister's weeping voice, "Of course, sis. I love you both. I knew you wouldn't want him seen with me, so I guarded from a distance till a hero came. Did I cause you any trouble?" His sister laughed lightly as she spoke. "You saved my son Zen, you have never caused us trouble. But next time my baby is separated from me, please bring him home to me. It could help the world know how good you are inside." Zen chuckled. "Okay, I promise." He broke his word and failed to bring her baby home. He allowed his nephew to pass away. A loud bang reaches Zen's ears, and he finally notices his surroundings. Everyone, including him, turned to face All Might, who was standing next to a wall with his fist inside. It seems that he recently found out about Izuku Midoriya's passing. The overgrown man whispered to Zen, "I'm sorry, my son. I failed you, but no one else could hear." Zen left bad for the man, not realizing that the world's greatest hero was so close to his nephew. The villain made his girlfriend do it. He tortured the poor boy until she did. If it makes you feel any better, he died smiling. All Might turned away from everyone, wiping at his eyes to hide the tears before turning back to smile his usual smile. Of course he did, that is the kind of hero Izuku Midoriya is. Zen nods and smiles before standing up again. The officer who was previously speaking to the doctor approaches Uraraka. Gazing at the bus photo, Zen asks, "You will have to tell me stories about him, help me get to know the kind of hero he was." The picture was now well known throughout the world, especially since it included 3 students and 2 teachers in addition to 5 other people. Zen proceeded to examine the clues, which totaled 12. War, underground, below, transport, 4, file case, weak, fake, your, and closer than you think. The 13th and last clue they had was the most perplexing. It was just a string of mismatched numbers, 4129312, and an officer had just left. Zen stared for what seemed like hours before everything started to make sense as the officer crossed off the face of the 18th student. The police were astounded that this strange man who had just arrived had discovered more than they had in the previous few hours. He pointed to the 4 and said, "This is telling you how many villains. Transport is the quirk of one of the men that left. He can transport anything he touches through any obstacle. It's not really a teleport quirk because he has to carry them. As for the rest, I can't figure it out. The numbers don't make sense, there is no pattern." The numbers caught All Might's attention, followed by the remaining hints. He couldn't understand why the word, fake, was used as one of the clues. What was it they were implying was false? The killings were authentic. No one could have staged them. Additionally, the students were all authentic. Their personalities had not altered in the slightest. He was deep in thought, massaging his chin, when a young Monoma bursts into the room, his face frozen in horror. "We cracked the codes for the live feed. Why, you're not going to believe this," he said, clutching a piece of paper in his trembling hand. Shaking like a leaf in a storm, Ashido gazed at the gun before her. She continued to mutter to herself, and Todoroki and Uraraka knew that she had finally lost it. She had previously killed someone to relieve Kota of his suffering. This would be her second time being forced to kill. But for the girl, doing so and witnessing the deaths of all her friends had been too much. She was no longer the Ashido that everyone knew and adored after she reached her breaking point. She was operating automatically. She glanced around the table at all of her deceased classmates, the blood seeping into the ancient wood. She then glanced at Uraraka and Todoroki before grinning more broadly than ever before, saying, "I can hear them calling for me, for us. They want us to join them. I'll see you both on the other side." She then leaps onto her seat, anticipating that her gun will discharge. Nothing took place. She continued to jump until she began to scream, at which point she reached for the gun, placed it against her temple, and squeezed the trigger. There were no more bullets in the gun. As her pink friend started to scream and beg to die, Uraraka covered her ears and tightly closed her eyes. The villain laughed as he approached, holding his knife. "Poor girl, you don't have any bullets anywhere. How bad do you want to die? I want to hear you beg," Uraraka said, asserting that her deceased friends were awaiting her. Before he grabbed her by the hair between her horns, turned her head upward, and then sliced open her throat, the villain allowed her to scream and cry for 10 minutes, pleading for her life. Before the pink girl slumped forward to join their friends in the afterlife, Todoroki covered his ears to drown out the sound of her gurgles. After removing their arms from their ears with force, the villain loaded the gun with 1 bullet and gave it to Todoroki. Taking the shotgun from behind the boy's head, he moved behind him. "Now for the final show. Who will you choose, Todoroki? Kill yourself and leave the girl all alone, or kill her and wait to be rescued? The choice is yours, boy," he exclaims joyfully before disappearing behind his protective glass after doing the same for Uraraka. Todoroki's mind was filled with the voices and smiles of the deceased as he gazed around the table. Their jokes during study sessions in class or how rowdy they could get when pulling practical jokes on one another in the dorm. He could tell after just one glance at Uraraka that she was reminiscing about their carefree and happy times. Not smeared with their deceased friend's blood. She giggled lightly at the memory. "Everyone was so bummed hearing how close we got to all being expelled. Bakugo made Kaminari overuse his quirk and turn into a bumbling idiot." Everyone couldn't help but laugh. Todoroki smiles and nods in agreement. "Remember the day we all moved in together in the dorm house? That was right after we gained Bakugo back. I wonder what's going to happen to Princess Donut Sprinkle Bomb. Think someone will take care of her for us?" Uraraka smiles. "Of course, our families are probably taking good care of him right now." Uraraka smiles. "That's good." She looks at him. Do you think we would have had fun at the water park? Todoroki nods. We would have been laughing right about now, swimming in the wave pool and sliding down the water slides. Iida would have been screaming at everyone to stop running, while Mrs. Midnight beat Mineta for trying to peek into the girls' changing room. Uraraka smiles and closes her eyes, trying to visualize everything. Todoroki notices that her eyes are closed and raises the gun slowly. When she opens them, they widen. I am sorry Uraraka, mother, please forgive me. The last bullet was fired shortly after he said those words. The head of the city morgue had just finished telling the Bakugo family that the school would cover all of the costs and that they would be led to a room where the other parents were talking about the specifics of the joint funeral. It was only fitting that their families celebrate their lives and be buried together since the class had done everything together, including dying together. A small nature park that could be used for the class had already been identified by the city. In order to make others happy, their names would be engraved on a rock in the center, encircled by thriving nature. In addition to saving lives, the class's real objective was to inspire others. Mitsuki hears the new car arrive as she waits for her husband to exit the restroom. When the final one arrived with 2 families, her heart ached. She heard that their children committed suicide together. Mitsuki was relieved that she wouldn't have to face this alone, in a sick way. She obviously did not want any of the children to have died. However, it would have been difficult to deal with her son's death alone. Both she and her husband realized their son was gone when he never woke up from the punishment. It was a difficult car ride from school, and no parent should ever have to endure it. She observed the Yaoyorozu family being debriefed about everything in a private room. Soon after, a second car arrives, and her heart almost stops when her short friend enters. She was crying so hard that her eyes were bloodshot, but the tears haven't stopped yet. She moved to her friend and put her arms around her after pushing herself off the wall she was leaning against. They remained silent until they were separated by an officer, who then led Inko Midoriya into a private room to give her a briefing on the park and the funeral. Mitsuki was forced by Inko to swear that she would wait for her. Naturally, the blonde accepted and bided her time until her friend arrived. With the exception of the 2 families of the remaining 2, her husband entered the main room where all of the Class 1A families were present. They were organizing the funerals in every way. There would be a private one for just families as well as a public one. Before this incident, their kids were well liked worldwide, and many people wanted to join them in celebrating their lives. As soon as Inko emerged from the tiny room, she jumped into her friend's arms and said, I'm all alone now, Mitsuki. The taller woman shook her head and gripped her friend. No, you're not. You have Masaru and me. You won't be left alone, okay. Inko could only nod slightly, never letting her friend leave. They entered the main area after a few minutes had passed. The yelling almost made them jump out of their skins as soon as they opened the door. I'm telling you the chairs should have red cloth drapes on them, yelled Mr. Kirishima, holding a red cloth high on the table with his leg up. Mr. Aoyama, holding a golden cloth in his hand, almost pressed his face against the other men's, with his foot on the table. And I'm telling you they should be golden. White and gold to represent our golden children. The roses will bring enough red. A woman with blue hair got to her feet and waved her arms in hand-chop motions at the 2 men. Both of you are acting dishonorably. You are disrespecting the furniture as well as the other families. Inko and Mitsuki cannot recall her from the dorm room, indicating that she must be a parent of one of the victims on the bus. The only thing Inko could do was look up at Mitsuki, who looked down at her while they both tried not to laugh. They pondered whether their kids behaved similarly to these parents. The argument stopped when a brightly shining woman saw them standing in the doorway and got up from her seat, saying, "Not 2 more." Everyone turned to face the 2 women. As they find seats in the packed room, Inko holds her friend's hand tightly and says, It's not just us, there are still 2 other families that are still calming down. Before the blue-haired woman said, 3 left then. All of the parents in the room looked down at the floor, and some of them clenched their fists. The talkative Mr. Aoyama removed his foot from the table and asked, What are the police doing, are they even trying? His wife slapped him hard, reminding him that some families are still getting used to everything. Sorry for my anger, he said, bowing slightly. Inko glanced at the papers on the table and asked, Could you show us what you have planned so far? Mrs. Koda, a reserved woman, approached and showed the women and Masaru, who had joined his wife, what they had come up with. When Jiro and Kaminari's family joined them, the 2 men, who seemed to enjoy arguing, became agitated as they started to discuss an elaborate. They were swiftly brought up to speed, and when the subject shifted to music, Mr. Jiro soon joined in on the vehement shouting. A pink woman and her spouse entered shortly after the double doors opened once more. The woman fainted in the car on the way there while being carried by her husband. Knowing exactly what they were going through, everyone felt sorry for them both. Since her seat was larger than the stool they were given, Inko offered it to them. After expressing gratitude, the man took a seat. Inko watched the couple with her arms wrapped around her. She wished that Hisashi was with her right now. As an officer entered the room with a paper in his hand and said, "Can I have everyone's attention please?" They all sat down and turned to face the officer, dreading what they were going to hear. The game is officially over. The villain announced that it was over as one of the final students died, leaving one. And the police have now found the location of your children as well as the final survivor. All Might yells, "The hell you mean the live feed is fake?" Question mark. How is that possible? Monoma gives the man a terrified look but hands him the paper he was holding, explaining that there isn't a location, which is why no one could find it. It's a recording that would have had to be recorded before this day. All Might's eyes widened as he realized what the message in the van had said a week prior: blood will be shed tonight. The game had taken place 7 days prior, and they were 7 days late. There was no chance that they would ever save the students, and the villains weren't just playing with the kids, they were playing with the entire world. This must be what Clue Week was all about. He turned to the clues, saying, "Monoma, can you figure out these clues to their location?" Monoma nods in comprehension before turning to the clues and gazing at them in bewilderment. "You were able to figure out the video, so what makes the word, you're, a clue? That should only be used in," he gasped abruptly, then grabbed a blank piece of paper from the desk next to him and started writing. As everyone watched, Monoma jumped back, as if the paper had burned him, saying, "And no way." He stared down, eyes wide. All Might then joined him, staring in utter horror at what the paper said, and comprehending why the boy had acted in that way. Everyone turned to face the ground as, "Below Your Feet, Underground Forgotten War," was played. "Why, you're saying this all along? They have been in an old bomb shelter beneath us the entire time." Question mark quote. An officer screeches, looking like she wanted off the ground. "All the clues made sense now, closer than we think, they were right under us." Fake as in the fake live feed. Blood will be shed tonight, telling us that it happened that night, a week ago. The only clue left was file case, which must be where the door is. It's behind one of the police hundreds of file bookcases. An officer runs into the quiet room with a paper. "It's over. Too late," is the last clue. "Damn it, they ran out of time," he screams. Suddenly, the people who could get out hurried out to the file cases, and All Might begins tearing the shelves off the wall in search of the door, not caring that the papers are all over the place or that people are screaming at him to stop. Below us, the children are in a bunker. One of these is behind the entrance. For a week, the survivor has been by themselves down there. Someone yells, which gets everyone to start ripping down filing cabinets and bookshelves. "I found it," someone yelled a few feet down from where All Might was. Sure enough, the wall there was a different brick with a small hole showing the wood from the door. "Stand back." Everyone ran as the number 1 hero punched through the wall and the door, revealing many stairs. "I'll call an ambulance, just in case." All Might and 4 other police officers are given permission to go down there, someone yells. Any villains or waiting traps would be easily dealt with. All Might practically flew down the staircase until he reached a solid metal door. After a few punches, he was able to get through the door, releasing a god-awful smell of blood and death. An officer immediately puked from the smell and took on the responsibility of guarding the door outside the room. All Might cautiously entered, making his way to the table surrounded by bright lights and turned off cameras. The scene was even more horrifying in person than it was on camera, with all of the students present and covered in blood, none of them moving. A survivor was supposed to exist. He went to each student, feeling for a pulse, and when he discovered a weak but very noticeable pulse in young Uraraka's wrist, he gasped. He carefully unchained her and lifted her up, but as he leaned down to do so, he saw Izuku Midoriya, who was smiling and appeared to be just sleeping. He was brought back to reality by a slight moan from the girl in his arms, and he got up and went to the door, saying, "You 4 stay here and guard them. One of us has survived." They all nodded and let the man pass, hoping the skinny little girl would live. He hurried her to the ambulance, which sped off while attempting to keep her steady, and All Might took a moment to watch it speed into the distance. When he reached the top, he had full passage through the massive crowd to the exit where the ambulance was waiting. Everyone stared at the poor thin girl, the blood of her friends nearly as brown as mud from being on her skin for so long. After 16 hours, the death game was finally finished, and the world had its lone survivor, just as the villains had predicted. He would have sat down in the middle of the street, exhausted, but he became concerned when a lot of yelling started going on inside. Did he miss a villain hiding down there? Did he just send off that child's last hope because he missed someone's pulse? The poor kid was struggling to catch his breath when an officer ran outside and said, "All Might." We went down to bring the others back up. All Might put his hand on the young man's shoulder and said, "Easy now, deep breaths, what happened?" The villains. 3 of them. They killed the 4 officers down there and took the bodies. After that day, a whole week passed. The media found it most difficult to report that the live feed was a fake after they were given all the information minus the graphic or private details, of course. Except for the police and family, no one else knew Uraraka's location. As the media displayed the images of the 21 people who had died in this tragedy, the entire world fell silent. An uproar quickly ensued after the world learned that all of the students' bodies had been taken. Everyone felt that the victims' families should have closure. All Might carried 3 flower boutiques as they made their way to Aizawa's hospital room. For Uraraka, present Mike, and Aizawa, 1. Aizawa fell into another coma after the doctor had put him under sedation. He hasn't woken up since that day, and he has no idea what happened to his students. All of them hoped he would recall the events on the bus, or even the time he needed to be sedated. He could not have smiled more as he entered the room and saw the black-haired man sitting up and conversing with a doctor and a nurse. All Might, we'll be done in a second with him," the nurse said, noticing him in the doorway. All Might gave the woman a nod before heading to the bed where present Mike was lying. The smaller man's condition had remained unchanged in the coma for more than 2 weeks. With no brain activity, the doctors were concerned that the man would never awaken. After replacing the flowers next to him, All Might went to Aizawa's flowers and changed his own. All Might nods and sits down, saying, "I can handle it, thank you, nurse." The doctor leaves the room after finishing the tests, and the nurse turns to All Might. He remembers up until the doctor sedated him. "He asked for you to tell him what he has missed if you are okay with it," she says. "The last thing I remember was Bakugo killing the villain and then them all being punished. What happened after that?" Aizawa turns to the man, who had become thin from going in and out of comas but looked much better just by being awake. Knowing that his friends detest it when people sugarcoat anything for them, All Might glanced at his hands. They were electrocuted for an entire hour, and Bakugo and Tokiyami never woke up from it, he said. Then, holding hands, Jiro and Kirishima committed suicide. Subsequently, Yaoyorozu committed suicide, Uraraka was compelled to murder Midoriya, the villain murdered Ishido, and Todoroki chose to end his own life rather than take Uraraka's. Aiza's fists were clenched so tightly on the sheets that his knuckles were whiter than the sheets themselves. "She's in the room across from here, still recovering." "What else?" The live feed was a fake, a pre-recording from a week prior, All Might said, glancing at his friend. "The night we discovered that message in the moving truck was when the game took place. We saved Uraraka from that room after she waited for a full week. The room was in a subterranean war bunker beneath the police station we were in." Aizawa looked to his left to his open window and said, "All Might, I'm retiring from being a teacher," which was to be expected given how close they were and how nobody knew. "And a hero." All Might could only nod, realizing how defeated he felt. If All Might could, he would also retire. The destruction of Class 1A was what finally broke him after all these years of being a hero. Losing his son Izuku was the final straw. "We received the most assistance from Monoma, a Class 1B student and the Roaring Taiga's leader Zen, who also happens to be Izuku Midoriya's uncle. This was the result of 4 villains going rogue, but the Roaring Tiger was not involved. In reality, the Roaring Tiger no longer harms innocent people. After nearly dying during execution, they changed their ways and are now pursuing other evildoers." Aizawa gave a small smile but remained silent. A long period of silence was followed by a spine-tingling scream coming from the other side of the hall. All Might put his arms around Aizawa, attempting to keep the man in bed, and Aizawa recognized the voice. "You will only frighten her to death if you rush in right now. She's just having a nightmare." Aizawa stopped struggling, leaning back into his pillows. He looked towards the doorway that lead to the hallway. When can I see her? All Might smiles and says, once she settles down, she usually comes in to check on you before heading to her therapy sessions with her family. In addition to breaking several of her ribs in the chair, she is having a lot of difficulty walking as a result of the electrocution. But, when Aizawa heard a door close in the hallway and then heard sobs, he wanted to ask, the worst is her eyes. After she had calmed down a little, Uraraka's mother, who was struggling to accept how broken her daughter was, entered Aika's room and said, hello All Might, how is he? He's awake. She gasped, staring at the very much awake Aizawa. Aizawa waves at her, how is Uraraka? She's been better, but the nightmares are getting worse, she says as she moves to the side of the bed. Her already wounded body is being harmed by her outbursts. The doctor gave her a feeding tube last night to help her eat, but she still won't eat anything. All Might smiled and gave the woman the thumbs up, saying, don't worry. It's going to be a long time before she's ever okay again, if she can even be. She might feel better after seeing Aizawa. Let's go see if your teachers are awake, perhaps that will cheer ya up, said the mother, who could only nod before hearing a door open and turning to see her husband pushing Ochako Uraraka in a wheelchair into a room. He stopped walking in astonishment to see Aizawa awake, and he grinned at the ball of blankets on the wheelchair, where Uraraka was in an unhealthy little ball, with only the tubes from her IV and oxygen in her arm visible. Aizawa looked at the small bundle sad, reaching a hand over and carefully lifting a piece of blanket to reveal her brown hair. You know, it's rude to hide from the person you're visiting. Never has he seen her move so fast. She was freed from the ball of blankets in a flash, staring with brown eyes the size of saucers at her teacher. Aizawa now understood what All Might meant about her eyes, they were dull and empty. They lost their spark completely and it may never return. He gave her the best smile he could and ruffled her hair. What's with that face? Didn't write me off as dead, did yo? He was cut off by her jumping up and tackling him in a tight hug. He wrapped his arms around her gently. She was so skinny, he could feel her bones poking him. He whispered in her ear, it's okay now, it's all over, she cried after he said those words. No one could understand how she felt, but Aizawa was there. He knows what it felt like on that bus. Of course only she could know what it was like in that room, but Aizawa knew she needed to hear from him it was all over. After all, they were the last remains of what once was Class 1A. With all his might, he prayed that it was finally over. Inko bent down and laid her flowers in front of the enormous statue in 1A Park. The statue was golden, with 19 human-like figures standing atop it, one arm raised, striking the plus ultra pose. The names of the 19 Class 1A students who died were displayed on the statue, and above the names was a picture Izuku had taken of the bus with everyone on it. Naturally, the villain was taken out of the picture, leaving it a genuinely joyful image. Every student had a rock around the park that described who they were as a person in a picture of that particular student. Mitsuki smiles at the statue and surveys the park, which was filled with flowers of all kinds, new sakura trees, and tiny fish ponds. The children would adore this location, Inko, if they were present. All of the parents of Class 1A agreed, hoping they were the only ones to ever experience this. The two women have gotten closer again. The deaths of their only children in the same disaster gave them a feeling no one else could ever share, Mitsuki says, looking around as well. Following this incident, the school was heavily attacked by the public, and they were unable to guarantee the safety of their students, which led to many parents removing their children. The Class 1A dorm house has not been touched yet, and everything is still as the children left it. Mrs. Todoroki took in the class cat, Princess Donut Sprinkle Bomb, who has prevented the mother from killing herself twice and alerted the hospital to her impending suicide. Mitsuki and Masaru had a major argument, which led them to decide to spend some time apart. At the moment, Mitsuki lives with Inko, sleeping on the couch, and neither of them dared approach Izuku's room yet because it was too soon for that agonizing step. They walked down a path through the park to their son's rocks, which were placed by each other to symbolize that they are still close even in death. My brother Zen is joining the police force. He and the Roaring Tigers are going to be undercover villains for the police and help take down the biggest threats, Inko said, touching her son's rock as though she were touching him. He refers to it as the Izuku effect. She chuckles, recalling how animated he was discussing it, and realizes that her younger brother hasn't changed over the years. Mitsuki grinned and shook her head, saying, I still find it hard to believe you had a brother that you kept from me the entire time. After both funerals, Inko smiles and starts walking once more. She and her brother grew closer after the funerals, and Zen always wanted to hear stories about his nephew. She had to get upset with him several times and send Mitsuki after him because he tried to take her pictures of him, which she treasured more than anything else, especially now that she wouldn't be getting any more. They watch as two young boys march together, one holding a bucket and the other a butterfly net, reminding the two grieving mothers of their sons that they were always playing together at that age. Inko smiles up at her friend. Should we go home? Mitsuki smiles and nods. Yeah, it's better soon or else Zen might eat out the refrigerator and take all your pictures again. As they make their way to their car, Inko chuckles. She swears that she caught a glimpse of her Izuku standing next to his rock, grinning at her, while Katsuki leaned against him, his arms folded, trying to conceal his smile. But when she looked back at the figures, they were gone. What's wrong, Inko? She looks back at her anxious friend and shakes her head, saying, no, everything is fine. After yawning and extending his arms above his head, the Mohawk villain entered a room where a short man with short brown hair was working. If he could, he would be far away from this place. He didn't want to be involved in this. He wanted to return to Zen, but that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. How is he doing? Doc, is this the final one? Doc, who always wished to use his quirk for the greater good but was always forced to use it for evil by villains, nods as he completes his work. Just finished boss, this is the last one. Should I place him alongside the others? As he wheels the cart down a bright white hall, the Mohawk man nods to him and watches. There are tiny glass rooms on either side of the hall, and all but one of them are occupied by sleeping figures who have gone through the doctor's hardcore healing sessions. After he gets the final subject into the final room, he locks and seals the space. What boss now? He looks up at the man who is grinning from ear to ear and asks, now, let's get game 2 ready, doctor. After turning off the lights, they exit the corridor of rooms, leaving the 15 students in Class 1A to sleep in total darkness.
I will continue this story in next part. Till then, bye bye.